Beastman tribe's side. Durka Wildheart, the current generation's chosen of the beast gods. Description: Durka was a beastman who, in his youth, was captured by the Rian beast slavers and sold to a very well-to-do noblewoman with some very kinky tastes. He, unlike many of his kind who found themselves in his situation, did not immediately lash out. Instead, he played the long game, earning the trust of his sick and perverted so-called master and eventually convincing her that he was tame enough to be let out of his shackles and have his slave mark erased. Needless to say, he took full advantage of the lack of foresight and Macron vet copyright of his master, and when she demanded that he please her, he did so broken bar. Up until he used the very same tools that had enslaved him to mark his new pet as his slave. After taking full advantage of his former master, Durka used his newfound control over the bitch to allow him to escape to a hidden grove along with his prize. Over the next 5 years, Durka led raid after raid upon Rian settlements, merchant caravans, and even led a raid that ended up freeing over 100 of his kind from the dreaded Auschwitz labor camp. However, all his actions eventually got the Rian so angry that they scoured their nation for him, eventually finding and razing the sacred grove he had called his base camp. By the time they got there, he and his band had already moved on and fled back to the Kainerous forest that had become the last true safe haven for the Beastman tribes. The only proof the Durka had been there, besides the obvious tribal markings and fetishes, was the broken body of his former master, her stomach cut open in what could only be described as the aftermath of a savage C-section done with no regard for the mother's life. A broken bar. Blair Wildheart, the beast witch of the dark forest and the most powerful shaman born in over 10 generations. Description: Blair was the end result of her father and mother, Durka, and his former master having a very broken bar rough relationship. While no one knows for sure what happened that led to her conception, it is rumored that Durka enacted a dark and terrible ritual that empowered his child with evil magic, on the condition that she not be born for over 4 years. It is said that when the former master was found, her stomach was cut open and even then was swollen beyond belief, as her hips were not wide enough to allow the beast witch of the dark forest to be passed through them. Of course, this is the story told by the Rian, but the real story isn't that much different aside from Blair being carried for only 2 months more than normal. Her father, the current leader of the United Beastman tribes, had indeed enacted a ritual to empower her upon her mother's capture, along with during and after Blair's conception, gestation and eventual birth, but said ritual was performed many times over the course of the years leading up to her eventual conception and during her time in her mother's unwilling womb. On a different note, she leads a sub-faction within the Beastman tribes comprised of the females, or Raiders, that wish to take revenge for all the acts of cruelty inflicted upon her kind by the Rian, although, not in the normal way. No, she wants to use magic to break the wills of her hated foe, reducing them to a state where they are nothing more than living dolls with their wills trapped within. Only then, she claims, will her kind be free to retake its ancestral home and let the Rian feel the full fury of her race. Among her kind, her usage of magic is second to none, and she had many suitors all eager to have children with her. However, the appearance of Vaile has led to many does, including she herself, having the lofty ambition to bear a strong litter of children with Vaile, and thus many bucks are finding it difficult to woo their desired mates. This may come to a head with drastic and potentially cruel choices being made, either with or without consent for one or more parties involved. A broken bar. Best Tyrell Kingdom's side. King Lion Simba Best Tyrell, a royal asshole and typical slave-holding douchebag with too much power and not enough checks on it. Description: Lion Simba Best Tyrell, yes, you say it as you think, is the king of one of the Rian nations and latest in a long line of self-absorbed entitled Uber jocks to take the throne. His nation was the one that was the first in line to take the former Beastman territory, owing the success they have achieved to the great Rian kings of ages past. The fact that Lion is a meathead is obvious to nearly everyone. His belief that his brute force is all that is needed is fully part of who he is, along with his belief that his royal nature and connection to the great Rian kings makes him untouchable and unassailable. He has continued his ancestors' great work in systematically removing the beastmen from the world, but has run into issues that he simply can't seem to solve. Namely, that he is a meathead and knows jack shit about anything other than full frontal assault tactics. Under his reign, the nation has declined, although this decline can also be traced back generations to his great-great-grandfather who, in a fit of idiocy, forced the bureaucrats that kept his nation afloat to fight at the front and die. The typical jock with too much in his favor who can't envision a future where he could ever be brought down by anything or anyone, Lion is almost certain to follow his predecessors in screwing up things even more than they already are. Crime is on the rise, corruption is rampant, the price of basic goods is rising while the nation's currency drops in value. Yet Lion sees none of it from his high perch above it all. It may very well take a potential apocalypse to get this prideful leader to look down and see the state his kingdom is in. At least this time, the Lion King will have no one to blame for the state of things but himself and his line. That is, if he actually knows how to take responsibility. A broken bar. Queen Liona Nala Best Tyrell, the royal slut and massive thought of the Best Tyrell Kingdom. Description: the current queen of the Best Tyrell Kingdom and whose name is a very clear rip-off of something you all should know. Liona is the very definition of a loose woman. She sleeps with anyone and everyone, regardless of stature, species and status, as long as they catch her fancy for long enough. She is able to get away with this due to her husband's utter focus on improving his own strength and looking good, which means she has ample opportunities to sneak someone or multiple summones or even multiple somethings into the royal bedchambers while her meathead of a husband is out doing God knows what somewhere far away. She has only one child, and she continuously thanks her lucky stars that the brat looks just enough like her husband as not to arouse suspicion, but in all honesty, she is really not sure of who the father is. Then again, taking multiple different people and creatures every day of the year and not keeping records tends to do that, especially in a time where there are no paternity tests. She may very well soon be getting all the AD she could ever ask for and more, and as long as she doesn't care what said AD is attached to, which she currently doesn't, she should be fine. A broken bar. Prince Lion Occult and Turd Best Tyrell, the crazed cat who should be in a madhouse and not commanding armies. Description: Lion was once a very calm, nice boy, if a bit silly and slightly unpredictable. Then he took an arrow to the knee. Thankfully, magic healed that right up, but the poison on said arrow was a beastman's specialty and was not fully treated in time, resulting in Lionel gradually becoming ever more erratic and unpredictable. Perhaps in an effort to keep the only heir to the throne from being eliminated, both his potential father and his mother made sure that their insane little bastard was well cared for. Lionel never fully recovered, and still suffers from extreme delusions, hallucinations and random and terrible mood swings. One day he may think that he is a tree and not listen to any ideas to the contrary, while the next he might believe that he is made of glass and be so afraid of shattering that he locks himself away and refuses any and all movement and contact. Both his generosity and wrath are legendary as well, with his erratic and chaotic tendencies meaning that anyone and everyone can be a target of his random acts of violence or just as easily be given anything they could possibly ask for. It is unknown what kind of future awaits him, as the nobles and clergy outright refuse to acknowledge his claim to the throne. Even in the event that he does succeed his father, his rule might be even worse than those who came before him. Any player that encounters him might also come off thinking that Lionel is a player too, at least one who is obsessed with references, puns, and jokes. However, this is not the case, and his words are merely the result of his completely altered consciousness. He almost certainly has no idea what the words coming out of his mouth mean to anyone else other than him. And odds are even if you were to find out what he was thinking at any given moment you would be left stunned and confused by the impossible to follow train of thought of the Mad Prince. He has been known to use magic, a feat uncommon among Rian, but the magic he uses always seems a broken bar off. In fact, his magic acts almost like it is not actually there and exists solely in the minds of those around him and those who are subject to his erratic whims. To make things more interesting, Those who he is serving beneath him, either willingly or unwillingly, eventually seem to become as mad as he is, or at least see the world through radically different eyes than everyone else. This can lead to them even being perfectly content and happy even when there is little to no reason to be, and seemingly able to switch from pleasant a father-knows-best-esque civilian to frothing mad psychopathic sociopath at the drop of a hat, or rather, at the erratic and uncontrollable whims of the prince himself. That is, if he even understands and comprehends what he has done and can do in the first place. A broken bar. All anyone in his nation who is of sane mind can hope for is that another poisoned arrow to the knee somehow restores his sanity, and that he lives through the ordeal as well. Vaile trudged through the dense undergrowth beneath the towering and twisting trees of the cinerous forest, the only sounds that could be heard being the crunch of the occasional leaf or the cracking of the occasional branch resulting from his foot coming down. Aside from those noises, the forest was deafeningly quiet, a sure sign that there was something nearby that was so dangerous that the normally vocal fauna decided that it would be in their best interest to be as silent as the grave they hoped to avoid. In fact, Vaile had yet to have heard any animal noises aside from the rutting beasts he had scared off just a few short hours ago. As he wandered, lost and alone, through the cinerous forest, he kept checking and rechecking his minimap, hoping that he could spot the trace of something, anything, that he could talk to. Alas, there was nary a soul to be seen, even by the holdover from his time in the game. Deciding that he had enough time to waste, he stopped and almost sat down near the base of the gigantic redwood-like trees, but the sound of a few rustling leaves and the cracking of a small branch set him into an alert state. Why? Because he knew for a fact that he was not the one to make those noises. If the freaking Hollow Man pops up, I'm going to punch its lights out. By other Hollow Man, Vaile meant a more recent take on an old creepypasta. He was not too sure about the lore behind the cryptid, but it was apparently some kind of ally or perhaps rival to some kind of really old internet boogeyman called a Slenderman. Given that the devs of the game dug into all kinds of nightmare fuel and internet legends for inspiration, Vaile was positive that some kind of old and new creepypastas had a trace in the game, and therefore in the new world. Alright, creepies. It's me, ya boy. I've got a great big can of whoopass, and if you don't want it served to you, I recommend you come out in the open. Cause if I have to come and find you myself instead of you making yourself visible, I swear to whatever gods or lack thereof that you hold dear that I will mess you up so bad your mother will never recognize you. There was silence in the dark forest once again, but Vaile was not interested in dealing with this shit. I'm going to count down from 10. If I reach 0 and you still aren't out in the open where I can see you with my flimsy human eyes, I will use my immense power to level this place. This was a bluff of course, but Vaile was not able to let his poor poker face be seen due to his mask and attire, so no one would have been able to tell that he could not fully back up his threat. T-10, 9, 8, 7. The nearby flora rustled a bit, but no one and nothing came out to play. 6, 5, 4. The sounds of something with a heavy build rushing through the forest assailed Vaile's ears, and his minimap displayed an entity with a level of 58 moving towards him at a high speed. Still, rather than pop out into the open, the entity stopped and hid in some foliage. 3. A broken bar to broken bar. The minimap began to light up as over 79 level 24 entities raced towards Vaile and the hiding level 58 entity. A near broken bar. Vaile's fake countdown to doom was interrupted as a poisoned arrow flew from the group of level 24 beings and smacked him straight on his mask's forehead. Soon, this was followed by a few other arrows, all tipped with the same paralytic poison. These then were followed by sling stones that had stun enchantments on them, and finally by a launched weighted net that fell on the unamused gamer and merely made him supremely disappointed with whomever or whatever was coming after him. The flora and shadows of the forest gave way and Vaile saw the individuals responsible for attacking him. The 79 level 24 entities were all Rian of various types. It was easy to tell that they were Rian rather than beastmen because, unlike the more fairy and often chimeral-like beastmen, the Rian had tails and animal ears, but not much else that would identify them as non-human. The Rian Vaile saw were obviously as disappointed or even slightly more so than Vaile himself, as they seemed to be rather annoyed that they had not managed to capture their intended quarry. But they seemed to want to take their predicament in stride, as once they got over their irritation that they had not captured the mindless savage that they were hunting, they came to the conclusion that their current captive would work just as well. Among things spoken that made Vaile quite annoyed were lines such as, "Well, at least we can ransom it back naked. I think those clothes should fetch a pretty penny, and if it can afford them then it should have rich relatives to buy it back at a high rate. Nah, we should just sell it to a brothel. I mean, whatever it is underneath that fancy get-up, it should be attractive to someone. Yeah, and after we work it to breaking in a brothel, we sell it to a work camp while getting its ransom and then never hand it over. You, sir, are brilliant. I'll buy you an ale when we get back. Wanna stop by the whorehouse and break some Damas savages in? Sorry, but I don't stick my dick in animals." Needless to say, Vaile was far from amused. In fact, underneath his mask he bore a similar expression to the meme of the still currently alive Queen Elizabeth II of England. Not that anyone could have seen his face, but it was the thought that counted. Vaile sighed audibly as he reached up and began to tug at the weighted net that was draped over him, much to the mockery of his would-be captors. However, Vaile was through with their bullshit and wanted to send a valuable message. That message being that a mere level 24 could never hope to defeat a level 1000, even with so many other weaklings on its side, and said message began to be delivered when Vaile stopped toying around and ripped the weighted net to bits with his bare hands. As the Rian mob looked on in shock, Vaile stepped forward and took a rather Shakespearean bow. "My good and noble sirs," Vaile said in a theatrical yet mocking tone of sarcasm and irreverence, "it would seem as though you have ordered too much to ingest. However, being the demanding host that I am, I require that you enjoy the full can of whoopass that I serve to you. Alas, you may simply be unable to endure the meal provided to you, but I do hope you enjoy what I intend to serve. I worked long and hard to perfect the recipe, so enjoy your can of whoopass while you can, because you will be so full by the time I am done that you may have to enjoy their meals through a straw for the rest of your days afterwards." Vaile straightened up and took off his mask, which caused every single Rian in the opposing group to instantly lose their lunch. "That's it," Vaile said mockingly. "Just a taste of what is to come. Now you can understand what I'm cooking. Now then, since you enjoyed the appetizer so much, here comes the first course." And with that, Vaile walked forward and planted his foot into the crotch of the leading Rian tracker/hunter, crushing his anads with ungodly force and sending the poor sob flying in a parabola and into a decently sized shrubbery. Vaile repeated this action several times before the rest of the Rian managed to pull themselves together enough to try and mount a counterattack. As they surrounded him with watery eyes, dripping noses and the occasional dry heave, Vaile stood defiant and smiled. "Second course of whoopass is now being served. I hope you have room for it and 3 more after." Mzrag watched as the Rian he had intended to lead into an ambush were taken down, one by one, by the handsome devil he spotted from his hiding place. The vicious mockery that the human showed the obviously weaker Rian was enough to nearly make him laugh, but the knowledge that he could very well be next in the sights of the human was enough to keep him quiet and in camouflage. He did have to wonder, however, if the Great Liberator had planned for this to happen, because as far as Mzrag could remember, the ambush was not supposed to be just one terribly powerful human, but instead nearly 50 powerful beastmen warriors. As the human toyed with the Rian like they were children fighting a god, Mzrag thought back to how this had all started. A broken bar, called before Durka Wildheart himself, the great liberator and chosen of the beast gods, Mzrag had thought he was to be executed for some act or another, of which he had no idea which taboo he might have performed. Instead, he was given a task that a great many others had turned down due to the risks involved. The lot of those who refused were cowards who feared making a full commitment to the cause, even when news of the ruler of the beast gods deciding to manifest on the physical plane and lend aid to said cause had reached nearly everyone's ears. They were too fearful and scared that they might be captured by the villainous Rian and therefore chose to be safe and secure for the time being until the Rian decided to invade the forest and claim it for themselves. They were content to wait until they had no further places to run or fight and thus be ruined by their procrastination and apathy, a mindset that Mzrag certainly did not possess. In fact, such apathy and defeatism had angered him so much that, on several occasions, he had fought honored duels with those who tried to sway his mind, only for his opposition to fail at beating him. He knew there was a chance at victory, the beastman needed only to seize it. So, when he was tasked with raising hell in the bordering Rian villages, all to bait the enemy into pursuing him into a carefully prepared trap, Mzrag had jumped at the opportunity. He had done more than what was required of him, using his knowledge of the terrain to ambush and slaughter well over 100 Rian who had gotten too deep into the Kainerous forest or who had strayed too far from their village. The previous 3 weeks had allowed him to effectively rampage to his heart's content, and using his uniquely beastman form he had managed to jump over palisades and set fire to granaries, barns, fields and even a good number of houses before the hunters arrived. After they had shown up, he began to follow his orders again, leading the pursuing slave catchers on a wild chase through the forest, through pitfalls, spikes and even stolen bear traps and more, slowly whittling down the number of those after his tail. They never managed to get close enough to tag him, but he also made sure that they never got far enough away from him to lose his scent. It was a twisted game of cat and mouse, that was soon about to end. He was now in the final stretch, his muscles were beginning to scream at him to take a break, but he knew full well that while some Rian had been left behind to die, others were still on his tail and had chugged stamina potions to help them keep the chase going. He was just about to power through the last 10 or so kilometers before he sensed the powerful presence that seemed to instantly manifest before him, just a few hundred meters ahead of his position. He could tell that the presence was that of something so powerful that if it wanted to it could destroy everything he cared about. So even though the hunters were nipping at his heels he made the tactical and strategic choice to abandon his orders and hide himself. He put every last bit of power he could muster into this attempt at concealment, but the entity ahead appeared to know exactly where he was. It demanded that he reveal himself and began counting down, claiming that if it reached A0 it would annihilate everything around itself. Now filled with primal terror, Mzrag did the only thing he could think to do in his situation. He played the part of the terrified prey animal and was stock still, hoping desperately that his hiding spot was good enough and that the being ahead of him was merely bluffing. The Rian, who were unable to track him any longer, instead decided to provoke the ire of the alpha predator that Mzrag had hid himself from. They did the most foolish and idiotic thing you could do when facing something so much stronger than oneself. They attacked it while mocking it incessantly. As the Rian gloated and praised themselves, it was painfully obvious to Mzrag that things were about to go sideways because while the Rian hunters could not read the room, Mzrag certainly could. He could feel the anger rising in the masked figure, and when the being finally had endured enough, he watched in horror as the enchanted and weighted net that had captured so many of his kind was ripped to bits with what seemed to be minimal effort or force. It was then that the entity began to return the mockery hefted upon itself several times over, all while its absurdly attractive face caused the Rian to void their stomachs and nearly pass out due to how goddamn good-looking he was. Mzrag could not believe that there was a human so absurdly handsome in the whole of the world, and nearly passed out due to the blindingly brilliant good looks of the being that was currently toying with the Rian. He had no idea who or what the being he beheld was, but it certainly could not be human. It was then that it hit him. He was gazing at Vaile, the ruler of the beast gods himself, who had descended from the great beyond to aid the kin of his followers in their time of need. Instantly, the fear he had experienced up till this point fell away, and in its place was reverence and devotion. Mzrag emerged from his hiding spot and rushed towards the now crippled Rian. With a few quick blows, he knocked each one out cold before kneeling to his liege. His kind had been promised that they would have his aid once he was done with Red Mountain. And now here he was. It was time for the tribes to take back what had been stolen from them, and they would be led by mighty Vaile. Vaile was a bit stunned by the sudden rush from the beastman who had attempted to hide from his minimap, but when the mix of deer, bear and gorilla parts bent the knee to him. He calmed down a little. The beastman identified himself as Mzrag and had intended to lead his pursuers into an ambush, only for him to run into Vaile. Immediately realizing how dangerous Vaile was, he attempted to hide from Vaile and then watched with a mix of fear and respect as Vaile continuously crotch-kicked the Rian that had attempted to capture him into submission. Needless to say, Mzrag was very much into the idea of Vaile leading the retaking of the Beastman's ancestral lands, and Vaile had promised to lend his support to the Beastman tribes once his business in Red Mountain had been completed, which it, for all intents and purposes, was. Now Mzrag was leading Vaile through a path towards the ambush site, going slowly enough so that Vaile would not be left behind or get lost. The carnivorous forest was more than capable of turning one around, as Vaile had noticed during his wanderings when he passed the same group of mushrooms a good 7 or 8 times before stumbling upon Mzrag and the Rian on his tail. It took a special kind of being to avoid getting lost, and unfortunately for Vaile, he did not have the prerequisite levels in any ranger class, subclass to allow him to navigate the maze-like forest aside from the man-made paths that had to be routinely cleared so that the very risky business of travel could be achieved. Vaile eventually was told to wait in a certain spot for Mzrag to return, which he patiently did as the minimal sunlight that managed to peek through the dense overgrowth began to fade away and night began to descend on the dark and twisted foliage. Eventually getting tired of standing around doing jack all, Vaile took a seat by the base of one of the massive trees that made up the forest and put up a barrier before nodding off to sleep, safe in the knowledge that no one could touch him. A broken bar. Meanwhile, Mzrag attempted to stare down and up at his leader, the chosen of the beast gods and the great liberator, himself. Durka Wildheart was a colossus of a beastman, towering at least a head or two over even the strongest ape purebloods, a trait his daughter shared with him. Durka glared at Mzrag with a look that could kill if it were any more intense, and quite literally too. Durka had, in his youth, taken the body of a beholder he had killed, torn all of the eyes from their sockets, and had his daughter fuse them together into a pair of eyes that he had implanted in place of his own natural eyes, meaning he could quite literally kill someone with a glance. Mzrag knew that to try and fight Durka was beyond suicidal, but he had to at least try and convince his leader that the rumors of Vaile's arrival into the mortal plane and willingness to aid in their reconquest of the ancestral lands were true, but also that he had met Vaile himself and that he was ready to aid them. Durka, for all his intellect and wit, was skeptical of Mzrag and his claim. Certainly, the scent wafting off his tribesmen was potent, but it was still muddied with other scents and thus could not be identified clearly. Likewise, Durka had never actually met Vaile, let alone taken in his scent, so for all he knew Mzrag could have been deceived and potentially leading him and his people into a Rian trap. In the guttural grunting and howling that made up the beastman language, the two argued back and forth, with Mzrag standing his ground spectacularly and outright refusing to budge on his position that he had, in fact, encountered Vaile and Durka being the skeptical and cautious leader of their guerrilla movement. It was only the arrival of the hottest doe in all of the beastman race that started to shift the argument in a certain direction. "Father, what is that arousing musk?" The form of the greatest shaman in modern beastman history came from behind a tattered cloth that separated one part of the cave they were in from another. The doe of Duz sauntered over to Mzrag and almost began to court him before pausing and realizing that something about the smaller beastman's scent was off. "Broken bar, what being did you encounter that had such a pungent smell that it latched onto you so heavily? Answer me now, or I will rip the knowledge from your mind by force." Durka and Mzrag were taken aback by Blair's emotional state. Normally she was eternally calm, collected and emotionless, not even noticing the musk of other beastmen, or if she did notice she didn't seem to be aroused by it. Now, not only was she aroused by a scent, but she was about to kill someone just to find the being that may or may not have accidentally let such a smell attach itself to poor Mzrag. "Yeah, broken bar, I can take you to him, but your father thinks it may be a Rian trap." Blair looked from Mzrag to her father and back to Mzrag and finally back to her dad. "I keep telling you, old man, that the current Rians are too muscle-brained to make elaborate traps, but you never seem to listen. If you won't go to meet the obvious hunk of burning love that marked this fawn with such an amazing aroma, then I will." This was enough to make Durka give up. "Fine, I'll go too. If I'm going to meet one who claims to be Vaile, and he isn't, I'll gut him and be done with it." "Let's go." Mzrag and Blair nodded and the three began the rather long trek towards the being Mzrag had met. It was only about 10 minutes into the trek that Blair began to have a realization. "Wait a damn moment. Did you say we are going to meet a Vaile?" At which point she began to fret endlessly about how she should have doled herself up more. Vaile continued to wait patiently as the night turned back into day, although he did so while asleep and with his minimap set to alert him in the event that something or someone approached him. When next he woke, the still dim and shaded forest floor was barely touched by the errant rays of sunlight that managed to peek through the thick treetops. Yet, despite the beastman, who went by the name of Mzrag if Vaile's recollection served him, saying that he would be returning post-haste, Vaile was still alone and left to his own devices in the deep and murky forest. Vaile did not wish to leave his current position without a guide, especially since without any racial bonuses or levels in the ranger class and its subclasses it was nigh impossible to not get horrifically lost in the winding mass of gargantuan tree trunks and impenetrable undergrowth. Thus, he contented himself with making his currently inhabited area a bit homier. With a bit of minor earth magic here and a few pieces of furniture he had borrowed from the enemies of Red Mountain there, Vaile constructed a makeshift earthen shack for himself to occupy. Choosing a suitably comfy chair with suitably soft cushions that would make the unexpectable Spanish Inquisition approve of its torturous design, Vaile popped open his inventory and began an attempt to read as many of the books from the game world that he had gathered as possible. "Not where I left him to wait for us," Mzrag announced in the guttural and animalistic native language of his kind. "For your sake, Mzrag, you had best hope that this isn't some charlatan who managed to pull your leg. If it turns out that this isn't Great Vaile, then even if I do not rend you apart, my daughter certainly will." Mzrag looked over his shoulder at Durka Wildheart and then stole a glance at the other potential executioner nearby, Blair Wildheart, the daughter of the current Warkif himself. "Do have faith, father," Blair countered bluntly and with minimal concern for Mzrag's fate in her mind, instead hoping that her idol would be there and that Mzrag was not, in fact, getting his leg pulled and unknowingly leading them into a trap. "We both can tell the scent that was on the boy is only getting stronger as we move closer. And, in the event that little Mzrag was deceived, we not only will have to deal with him but also the bastard who dared to impersonate our god's god. But, to make absolutely certain that we are not unprepared for any potential fight a broken bar." With those words, Blair began to weave some very nasty buffs onto her father and herself, along with conjuring some rather sadistic active and passive magical defenses. After this, she placed temporary enchantments on her father's weapons, of which included a spiked whip, a heavily serrated blade he had stolen from one of his foes' corpses and a large, cursed battle axe that he had gained in a similar manner to that of his blade. With their insurance in place, the three beastmen moved forward until Mzrag stopped and rubbed his eyes. "Do you see what I am seeing?" Mzrag asked his leaders. "If by that you mean rudimentary earthen hut with a shingle roof out in the middle of the forest, then yes, I believe we do see what you are seeing," replied Blair, who was also quite confused by the little house that shouldn't have been there. Durka sniffed the air and grunted a single word. "Magic a broken bar." Both of his traveling companions turned to him and gave him a "Did you just figure that out?" look before moving closer to inspect the oddly placed domicile. However, before they could move much closer, the door to the shack was blown off its hinges by what looked to be a kick from a humanoid being from within. The entity that was living in the hut emerged and looked at the three beastmen, its eyes settling on Mzrag. "About time a broken bar," it muttered in a male, human voice that could, for some bizarre reason, be perfectly understood by the beastmen, as if the entity was flawlessly speaking their own tongue instead of the main language of the races. The entity gestured for them to follow it inside the doorless shack, but as soon as the entity went back inside, the door it had booted off the frame returned to the dirt it had come from and a new door took its place on the shack. The beastmen looked at each other, shrugged, and made their way inside the hut through the unlocked earthen door that was much more durable than they gave it credit for. Once inside, the overwhelming musk of a major stud assailed them like nothing had ever done before. After overcoming the initial shock of the odor, they managed to look at the entity and see it without the heavy clothing and mask it had worn just moments prior. And it was at that point several things happened. First, Durka fell to his knees and began to beg his gods for forgiveness for ever doubting that the being he was so reluctant to meet was in fact Vaile himself, the god of his kind's gods. Second, Blair began to go into heat and just barely stopped herself from trying to arouse Vaile with some dough in heat emissions, realizing in the nick of time that her idol probably wouldn't appreciate her leaving her scent all over his nice and fancy rug. Third, Mzrag thanked his lucky stars and the will of the gods that he had not, in fact, been deceived. Ever since he had started arguing with Durka a little while ago about whether Vaile was indeed Vaile, he had a sliver of doubt in his mind that maybe, just maybe, he was leading his leaders into a death trap. And finally, Vaile looked up and motioned for all three guests to take a seat. Little did any of them know that while Vaile had not intended to do so, he had inadvertently put a massive target on the backs of both him and his guests. Turns out that, unbeknownst to him and the three beastmen, his house had been found by a second party of Rian hunters and they had just barely witnessed two of their biggest targets enter a small hut with no obvious means of escape beyond the main door and a few small windows. Even beastmen with their powerful noses could not smell something that was upwind from them, and there was now a trap being set. It was only when the alarm Vaile had set for such an event went off and alerted him to the low-level idiots trying to encircle his improvised and temporary house from roughly half a kilometer away did he decide to tell his guests that they had been followed and not by the paparazzi. As the three beastmen prepared for battle, Vaile put on his garments and mask and walked up to the closed door as the Rian hunters drew closer. It was clobbering time. Vaile wasted no time and once again booted the earthen door to his improvised and temporary housing off its equally earthen hinges, sending the door flying off into the air and then directly into the face of a rather unfortunate Rian hunter. Said hunter then obeyed one of Isaac Newton's laws of motion and went flying, eventually impaling himself on a well-placed fallen tree branch, driving said branch straight through his flimsy cloth garments and through his gut. As the shocked Rian looked on, Vaile strode out from his for the moment lodgings and, in a voice that commanded both respect and fear, demanded one simple thing. "What are you doing in my swamp?" Taken aback and confused by the nonsensical question and the event that transpired prior to it being asked, the Rian hunters were unable to react fast enough to mount any kind of decisive action against their intended targets. In fact, Vaile used this remarkable opportunity to race over to a hunter with speed that only a high-level player could muster and proceed to plant both feet into the unfortunate son's face, resulting in said face and the head attached to it exploding like a 4-week-old jack-o'-lantern that had been hit by a 4-door sedan moving at 50 miles per hour. This only shocked the Rian into even more of a stunned state, and Vaile, being the troll and eccentric that he was, took the opportunity to withdraw into the brush and out of sight, using his minimap to keep from being lost as he climbed up a tree and waited for another moment to show off. At this moment, the three beastmen burst out from the compressed dirt hut, with Blair using her massive black owl wings and the magic to rocket up through the roof. While Mzrag charged out the now doorless front door and Durka burst through a wall like a hairier and more aggressive animal version of the goddamn Kool-Aid Man. This shook the Rian out of their stunned state and the fight began for real. The Rian hunters had been prepared and had all the tools they needed to catch a beastman or three, but they had only ever used such tools against low-level or juvenile beastmen. Their tools were, for all intents and purposes, useless against a being that was as high-leveled, relatively speaking, as the three they were attempting to take on. Not to mention all three beastmen had a history with dealing with these kinds of tools. This meant that the weighted nets, paralytic poison-covered darts, arrows and knives, and even their thrown bowlers has minimal if any effect on those whom they currently faced. Not to mention there was a fourth combatant hidden and waiting for another chance to show off. One of the Rian was sent flying as Durka backhanded her into the trunk of a large tree. Said Rian popped a potion and was about to return to the fight when she heard the crackle of someone running at her from outside the immediate combat zone. She barely turned around and saw what, or rather who, was charging at her before slipping into death, as the fully cloaked entity from earlier shouted something she couldn't understand while smashing her over the head with a metal object. A broken bar. Nyantani watched as his wife was backhanded into a tree by the feral savage that was raging uncontrollably. He then watched with joy as Hisby drank a potion that he had bought her and moved to re-enter the fight. However, his joy was short-lived as the entity from earlier that had kicked the head of one of his companions so hard his head popped trashed out of the brush and yelled something in multi-race common. "My God!" In comes Vaile with a steel chair. With that shout, the man in heavy clothing smashed his girlfriend over the head with a flattish metal object so hard that the metal itself bent and Hisby's skull caved in. Outraged and distraught, Nyantani tried to leap onto the entity, but said being dodged to the side with minimal effort and, with a kick to his stomach, sent Nyantani tumbling up into the air. As he fell back down to the ground, he heard the being say more nonsense before a fist to the face ended his thinking for good. "I got this from a certain fictional hunter. A broken bar eat some a rock, why don't ya?" A broken bar. Blair's magic called forth razor-sharp thorny vines from the ground and made them wrap around a Furian. As the vines wrapped around their target, Blair directed them to constrict tighter and move around as they did so. The clothes on their bodies were soon shredded along with their flesh as her victims screamed in agony and their blood flowed out from between the serpentine thorny brambles. A Furian attempted to free their companions, only to have Blair direct even more wicked spells at them, twisting their bodies and minds into something more akin to a monster than a member of the races. By the time the incantations had run their course, both those wrapped by the brambles and those who underwent a rapid and agonizing biological change were either dead or utterly mad. Content with this, Blair dropped projectile spells on top of those few who yet lived with sadistic glee. Durka and Msrag, on the other hand, have no real magical potential of their own and contented themselves with merely beating their opponents to death, as though they were two rough and rowdy boys trying to make their sister's life miserable by destroying her rag dolls. And, to be brutally honest, they were having a blast doing so. Perhaps they felt something cathartic and calming about ripping someone's leg off and then beating his ally to death with it before using it as a spear to impale a third person. Or maybe they were just doing it for the love of violence and a sense of revenge for those who had suffered at the hands of those like the ones they were killing. Who knows? Either way, they seemed to be having a grand old time with what they were doing, and neither Vaile nor Blair seemed to be inclined to stop them from having their fun. The Rian hunters, or what few remained of them, on the other hand, had endured enough of the obviously bad situation they had put themselves in and broke into a wild run through the treacherous Kynaris forest in an attempt to escape death. Some few managed to get out of sight, but more than an insignificant number fell as they ran like the terrified fools that they were. Vaile and the three beastmen took a look at their bloody work and concluded that it was time for a change of scenery. And with that decision they made their way back towards the hidden main encampment of the unified beastmen tribes. When Vaile and the three beastmen entered the hidden base of the combined tribes, there was, of course, shock and confusion. However, the initial surprise of Durka bringing someone that looked to be one of the races into their secret encampment was almost immediately replaced by the shock that said being was, in fact, Vaile, the god of their gods. This in turn caused a whole clusterfuck of other things to happen, including but not limited to the Adas all going into heat all at once, the Abucks all getting worked up by the mixture of Vaile and the Duzmusk, and Vaile himself wishing he had some way to block the overpoweringly rank scent of a beastman and heat fluids from assaulting his olfactory system. Durka seemed to grasp that Vaile was not at all aroused by the aerotic scents wafting through the air and quickly escorted him to one of the deeper parts of the cave system that the combined tribes called their temporary home. Blair also tried to avoid causing undue distress, but this was accomplished by launching several fireballs into the crowd of arouseders in order to shoo them away and put a damper on their arousal. While Durkar acted in such a way to further the interest of his master's master, Blair instead operated more on a principle of a Vaile is mine, not yours, so fuck off you damn mate stealers. A broken bar. Vaile was once again in a position where he could not fully undress himself without people desiring to shag him coming out of the damn woodwork. The cavern he was now calling a home was far enough away from the rest of the beastmen, but the simple act of disrobing was enough for his reversed attractiveness perk to come into effect and ruin his day. After the third time he had been unable to get his shirt off without a bunch of dust breaching the guards posted outside his room, Vaile admitted defeat and simply kept his clothes on at, almost, all times. A broken bar. I apologize, mighty Vaile, for the actions of my kin. I can't blame you, Durkar, for your people acting based on their primal instincts. Vaile replied, trying to lift Durkar from his kneeling position, only to have the massive beastman return to the position immediately afterwards. I just have to be more careful, that's all. Your mercy is great and overwhelming, mighty Vaile. I pray that we meet the expectations you place upon us. Yes, yes. Now please, we have things to discuss and we can't exactly plan the reconquest of your ancestral lands if you keep kneeling like this. Yes, of course, Durkar responded, finally rising of his own volition. Now then, Vaile said as he approached the war room's main table, how exactly are we to go about this? Yes, I think I see how we can wean a broken bar. This last sentence was something that piqued the interest of the Beastman tribe leaders and great shamans. What ingenious plan would the god of their gods have in store that would win them the war? Vaile looked over the mixture of Beastmen and Rian-made maps and models, each painting a radically different picture of the situation at hand. Some maps were decades old, while others were made merely a few weeks ago at most. All of them had one thing in common, however, and that was that the chinerous forest was slowly but surely being removed from the maps bit by bit. As the forest shrunk, so too did the hiding and hunting areas of the beastmen shrink. The chinerous forest was a magical forest, and if it wasn't routinely pruned it would expand at a very fast rate all on its own until it reclaimed the area it once occupied. What this meant was that any attempts made to further the retaking of the formerly beastman-owned territory would have to involve laying waste to large swathes of Rian-controlled areas multiple times over in order to allow for the magic forest to reclaim the area. However, the Rian had technology on their side, while all that the beastmen possessed was merely a more feral magic system and greatly enhanced physical abilities. The obvious answer to winning this fight was something that the beastmen had indeed been doing, but not nearly on the scale that they needed to. Vaile spoke 2 words, but his declaration about how the war was to be won was misunderstood. Guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare. No, it's a broken bar. Vaile sighed. Just let me explain it. A broken bar. A broken bar. My people, hear me. A crowd of Rian had gathered in their town square to hear the words of the mayor. They had done this song and dance a great many times before, but law dictated that, even when there was jack all for the mayor to talk about, it was something that had to be done. This time, however, there at least was something unusual for the mayor to announce. It is with great sadness and a very heavy heart that I tell you of the tragedy that has taken place just a short while ago. Merely 5 days prior, our boys and girls in the Hunters Guild were sent to deal with one of the mindless animal savages that haunt our kingdom. Last night, their bodies were discovered outside the town walls. Gasps and the sounds of grief filled what once was a silent crowd. Settle down. Settle down. While the bodies of the fallen were indeed brutalized without mercy, just as the savages are wont to do, they have been given a final rest. However, this slight must not stand. I implore all of you to increase your commitments to the Hunters Guild and to, in no uncertain terms, put your all into taming this feral land. If you see anything in the slightest bit suspicious, alert the militia. If you suspect your neighbor to be a beast lover, alert the militia. If you believe your neighbor is hiding supplies that could be used to further the Hunters Guild's efforts to destroy the feral monster men in the evil forest, Report them to the militia at once. Only through vigilance can we defeat the darkness that threatens civilization. You are now dismissed, Lord Mayor. Before the mayor could dismiss the other Rian, a runner from the town wall, which was less a true fortification and the more a thin line of 4-meter-high sharpened wooden poles, ran up and whispered something into the mayor's ear. The floppy dog ears of the mayor perked up at the words spoken to him and his tail began to retreat between his legs, a sure sign of fear. "My people, listen well," he yelled with a voice that only barely betrayed his panic. "The fields we have worked so hard to cultivate have been attacked by the savages. All men must join the militia and help fight off the animal people, or we will not survive the winter without making terrible sacrifices. To arms!" A broken bar. Unbeknownst to the Rian, the murder of crows that was watching them in their square were under the control of someone with what the Rian would call a evil intent. Their eyes and ears gathered the information that was unknowingly divulged to them, which was in turn sent to the being that bound them to its service. The massive owl-like raven-black wings of the great shaman Blair flapped again and again, keeping the form of the large beastman dough in the air alongside a healthy helping of magic. With a beastman version of a smile growing on her face, Blair launched a series of spells into the air. To the untrained observer, these would look to be signals, which they were, but as they were out at the usual 45-degree angle that most ground-dwelling animals looked around in, no one save those looking for them would have seen them. As the Rian town militia and the untrained fools who joined them marched into the wheat fields, they had no idea that they were bumbling headlong into a trap. With the wheat having grown taller than their heads, the Rian had no clue what they were walking into, and it would cost them dearly. "They are somewhere in the wheat fields. Spread out and track them down. Give them no quarter, save for placing a collar on their necks," bellowed a rather weighty but not morbidly obese Rian. This particular Rian was not large in stature because of his diet, but rather his girth was due instead to the fact that he was a hippopotamus Rian. There were some in the game who argued that making an obese Rian sub-race was pandering to a certain crowd, especially since the weight was mostly extra muscle and a protective layer of fat behind thick skin. That said, hippo Rians made for excellent tanks, usually able to dish out nearly as much damage as they received and, for a sub-race supposedly designed to be purely tanky in function, were surprisingly fast in short bursts with decent water movement abilities. This Rian, despite being a big, fat target, went out and waddled his way into the wheat field along with his fellows in the militia. He may have had the unfortunate condition of crushing wheat wherever he walked, but damn if he wasn't going to let that stop him from finding some beastmen and bashing their heads in with his big stick. Sure, he and his weapon may damage the food they need to survive and pay their taxes, but what would be worse than him and his companions crushing a bit of food grass is the beastman doing whatever evil thing the mindless animals were going to attempt. So, as he waddled through the wheat, occasionally sniffing to try and pinpoint the position of his enemy, he unknowingly wandered directly into a trap. He did not notice that he had tripped said trap until a few more minutes or searching came up fruitless. When he began to feel very unwell, he stopped his search for a bit to sit down and try and let the sickness pass, only to notice that the bottoms of his feet and the exposed parts of his legs were covered in lacerations and festering with some kind of ailment. "It's a trap!" he yelled as his strength began to fail and he slowly rolled over onto his back, only to hear nothing in response save the sounds of wind rustling the grains around him and the cawing of crows and ravens circling overhead. As he began to slip into sleep, he could swear that he smelled the ominous stench of smoke coming from a fair bit ahead. "A broken bar!" "The fields!" screamed a chicken Rian as she ran around like her head was cut off. "The fields! The fields! What is it? What's going on with the fields?" a rather annoyed member of the same race demanded. "They are burning. The fields are burning." With that being said, a handful of Rian more suited to climbing scaled the single line of sharpened wood logs that made their town's wall and beheld a horrible sight. Every single field that they had sown was alight with fire, and to make matters worse there were the silhouettes of the feral and savage beastmen painted upon the flames that made their backdrop. This was very, very bad. The militia had yet to return and, if they had truly moved into the grain fields as they said they would, were likely not to come back at all, alive or dead. The Rian townsfolk quickly began to panic. Their defenders were gone, their stores of food were nearly empty due to the longer than usual winter of that year, and now they had to deal with a siege by the monster men that still refused to submit to the wills of their genetic superiors. How could things possibly get any worse? It was then that they heard the chanting from the monsters. It was a single two-syllable name shouted over and over again. It was a name they all had heard about and all knew the suffering and terror that went with it. Those few who were brave and perhaps stupid enough to peer over the walls from one vantage point or another saw the nightmare that was slowly plodding along through the gaps between the burning fields and felt their hearts sink into the depths of despair. The chanting only escalated in speed and volume until it drowned out the screams of panic of the townsfolk and roar of the flames that were all around. Durka, 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 Durka. That name spelled doom for all who heard it, for in the wake of the nightmare of the chinerous forest there was left naught but pain, sorrow and destruction. The one who fully intended to destroy their civilization and bring the savage law of the beasts back to their homeland had come to claim their lives, their homes, and quite possibly their souls for his twisted and malevolent pagan gods. Only a miracle could save them from doom and despair, and such things were in very short supply. A broken bar. The beastmen were not just here, where Durka and Blair were. No, they had organized other, much smaller attacks and maneuvers in other places all along the outskirts of the best Tyrol kingdom. It was simply that this place was the primary target. Why, you ask? Was a simple farming town the highest priority target among all others? The answer to that should be painfully obvious. Despite being a town and not a city or fortress, it was the farthest major settlement in the entire Best Tyrol Kingdom from the capital and the closest of such settlements to the ever-dangerous Chinerous Forest. There was also one other reason that this settlement was chosen, and that was a more secretive one than all the others. For you see, wherever there was a large congregation of the races, there inevitably were those with a broken bar degenerate tastes. This was the case with this place, for this furthest bastion of civilization had a dark secret. It held a not so insubstantial number of beast cultists. Yes, that is right, there were Rian who worshipped the same gods that the beastmen did, but to a lesser extent regarding fervor and devotion. This meant two things. One, it meant that there were those who might very well be willingly self-conditioned towards viewing Vaile as their lord and savior, and to broken bar. Well, the beast gods did demand that their followers multiply via any means necessary, so maybe the cultists would be willing to do the dirty with what many of their kind considered to be mindless animals. Either way, the city was the main target of this first major offensive, and soon enough it would be filled with the howls and screams of both predator and prey alike. And, if a few Rian, male and female, were captured and forced to commit foul, debased acts and horribly evil deeds, well, a broken bar, despite what the kingdom's propaganda said, life tends to find a way. Isn't nature amazing? The more civilized areas of the Best Tyrol Kingdom were blissfully ignorant of what was transpiring at the very edge of their nation, and the beastmen made perfectly sure to keep it that way. As Vaile had so eloquently put it, the only way to avoid an immediate and overwhelming military response while the operation is going on is to systematically eliminate all forms of rapid communication between the affected and unaffected areas. In order for the destruction to be both total and unchallenged, any and all messages of any kind must be intercepted and eliminated. Otherwise the kingdom can and likely will send its military to undo our work and or utterly annihilate us. Taking the words of the God of Gods to heart, the United Beastmen tribes had, before the attacks had even begun, initiated a series of raids that were designed to systematically cut the lines of communication between the outlying frontier territories near the Chinerous Forest and the deeper parts of the Best Tyrol Kingdom. And now, as the pathetic Rian town burned and its people either died or were captured, the fruits of that effort were beginning to show. Had the preliminary operation not been undertaken, the villages and hamlets they had despoiled and then razed on the way to their current stop would have sounded the alarm, and the town they now were ransacking would have had a great deal more defenders. In fact, they might not have even been able to reach this destination in the first place if their previous encounters with the kingdom's military were anything to go by. As the nameless town burned and sacrifices were made to the beast gods, a single humanoid figure watched with unease as he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had quite possibly created quite the monster. With the beastmen uniquely suited for hit-and-run tactics and guerrilla warfare due to their animalistic appearance and capabilities, Vaile worried if they would merely stop their warpath at the final reaches of where the chinerous forest would willing end, or if they would decide that they could not risk another group attempting the same thing and continue to expand as though everyone and everything were an enemy. As the flames rose high into the night and the smell of blood, bile, feces and reproductive fluids filled the air in and around that town, nobody really knew just how far the war conquest would go, and no one knew what the final fate of those in the best Hyrule Kingdom would be. The two conflicting views on what should be done with their foe were beginning to generate tiny fractures in the cohesion of the unified tribes, and no one was aware of what that would bring. A broken bar. 2.5 weeks after the unnamed town on the edges of the kingdom was effectively razed to the ground and had its people either slaughtered or abducted, the other parts of the kingdom, those deeper in, began to feel the effects of the Beastman tribe's wrath. This was due to one of the most boneheaded things a nation could do in regard to internal policy, and that was to put all of one type of egg in a single basket. The way the best Hyrule Kingdom's resource management system operated was rather moronic. Instead of diversifying the areas in which they grew wheat and other foodstuffs, they instead continuously pushed the farms, pastures, and ranches to the edges of their nation, more specifically the edge that bordered the chinerous forest. While the land they occupied and had taken from the Beastmen was extremely fertile, thus allowing for practically any temperate crop or animal to be grown and raised anywhere in their nation, they had instead repeatedly forced farmers and livestock handlers to move farther and farther away from the main bastion of their civilization. This was in an effort to beautify and civilize the untamed wilderness, but it was also so that the higher-ups would not have to worry about the lower classes appearing within their cities and major towns. This, over time, drastically increased the strain on the food supply chain, and made it even harder for lower and middle-class citizens to live in the deeper parts of the kingdom. After all, when the prices of food and housing are much, much higher in one part of the nation than they are in another, the smart thing for the poor to do is to pick up and move out to the cheaper places. This state of affairs was shaky at best, and when the tithes of food that were supposed to have arrived a week ago never showed up, the situation in the middle and inner parts of the best Hyrule Kingdom began to degenerate rather quickly. On Earth, the common joke is that the French throw rats whenever the price of bread fluctuates, but at least they can afford not only the bread but other foods and drinks. In the best Hyrule Kingdom, however, it only took a few days for the price of a single loaf of bread to start reaching ludicrous territories. It is unlikely that Vaile or the Beastmen had anticipated this, but the fact of the matter was that they were not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. With the war progressing far more quickly than they had anticipated, some desired that the full might of the tribes be used on the cities and towns further away from the rapidly expanding chinerous forest. Vaile, however, had a different idea. Rather than try and risk costly sieges undertaken by those who knew nothing of siege warfare, the better option, in his mind, was to allow the best Hyrule Kingdom to implode and then take advantage of the riots and violence to mount conquests of each major settlement, one by one. They would never be able to destroy the larger settlements with the forces they had if the gates were shut, but when the places they wished to target were in the middle of citywide riots, the odds would be that the gates would be left open so as to allow the rich and well-off a chance to flee for their lives, or possibly allow the wrathful mob within to move outside. Although, the question remained, which place was the first to target? There were only a few valid choices, and after much deliberation, they settled on one in particular. It was a place the Beastmen cursed with every breath, a residence of slaughter, torment and immeasurable suffering for their kind. It was a place commonly referred to as the Pit, a city of slavers, mad scientists and torturers built into the remains of a strip mine. With their target selected, The combined tribes moved together to take the domain of despair known to the Ryans as Eden's Crater. A lone figure clad in a mixture of white and red clothing and wearing an ornate mask that covered its whole head walked lazily along the well-worn road leading up to the slaver's paradise that bore the name Eden's Crater. Although the clothes of the humanoid being showed off that said being likely was quite wealthy, no highwaymen or bandits had approached it during its travels from where it had come to this place it was currently at. As the entity stared at the large multi-layered and highly defensible singular entrance to this quite literal pit of despair, said being wondered internally at the sheer malice portrayed in every single object that the gate and walls had attached to them. All along the path leading up to the entryway, there were markers that showed the slaves that came and left this place exactly what their fate would be should they decide to resist. Large bird cages covered in barbs and spikes held the broken remains of those who were stuffed inside to starve or resort to cannibalism to survive for just that bit longer. Long since dead bodies hung on crucifixes and the horribly mangled remains of those who were beaten day after day as they were shackled out in the elements painted a clear picture as to who the people residing in this den of sin and vice happened to be and what their views on other, less fortunate people were as well. The great stench of the dead, dying and the mutilated hung in the air like a weighted blanket draped on the body of a young child, but Vaile had experienced something far, far worse in the cosmically not-so-distant past. As horrible as the odor here along the path to Eden's Crater was, it had nothing on the rank and fetid stench of the Rattan Under Empire, which, along with the fact that he didn't want to be trapped and used as a stud horse for the rest of his life by crazy rat women, made up a decent portion of the reasons why he fully intended to flee from them at every possible chance whenever or wherever they showed up. Oi, numbnuts, get ya fucking ass in gear. Vaile looked over his shoulder at the Ryan who yelled at him and was surprised to see something he did not expect. Sure, the Ryan had sub-races for every major mammal, bird and reptile on Earth, more or less, but Vaile had not expected a Ratarian to actually be a thing. He honestly had expected that the Rattan would have genocided the fake Rattan from existence, but here one was, yelling at him in a thick New Yorker accent. Move da fuck outa da fucking way, ya fucking douchebag. You fucking want I should fucking smack ya upside da head fucking and knock some fucking sense into ya. Vaile, miffed at being yelled at, walked up to the Ryan and planted a foot between his legs, causing every other male in the vicinity who saw, including the gate guards, to unconsciously flinch as the dumb bastard fell to his knees, a small, whining sound exiting his lips vaguely sounding like the single word question why? Vaile did not bother giving an answer and simply began to walk towards the gates, readying himself for the challenge ahead. He would have to act rather quickly, as the more he delayed his actions the more time the Bestial Kingdom had to discover the movements of the unified beastman tribes. After his previous display and a harsh glare at the guards, Vaile was allowed entry. It seemed that, in order to be allowed in, you needed to have a certain kind of roughness, and Vaile's unmerciful crushing of the poor Ryan's family jewels fit the bill. Besides, he doubted the Ryan would have been allowed entry to begin with, and sending him back with shattered ainads was, in some ways, better than having his empty bravado destroyed by the guards. Despite what some would claim, incessant use of expletives constantly does not make you a tough guy. A broken bar. As Vaile walked through the streets, he made sure to occasionally drop some dust he had in his inventory along the ground. It was, by the eyes of the Ryan who ruled the roost here, nothing special, but to those who knew what the substance was, it would have caused serious concern. Vaile made rounds upon rounds, depositing more and more of the dust that was slowly being absorbed into the ground and air and water in greater and greater quantities until a broken bar. The sound of a beastman roaring in mindless rage echoed through the immediate area that Vaile was in. This was followed shortly by yet more wrathful bellowing noises that quickly turned the bustling streets that were once filled with slavers and the merchants doing their dirty business into a scene out of the apocalypse. The slave collars and binding runes that had been intended to keep the merchandise in line seemingly had no effect anymore as the beastmen and other monsters that were collared and chained rampaged uncontrollably, sending structures grumbling to the ground and the Rian and their customers running for their lives. Vaile looked around at the carnage that was occurring around him and made his way to the walls that towered over 35 meters above his head. As the races ran around like chickens with their heads cut off, with some quite literally missing their heads, Vaile backed up and made a running tackle through the wall segment in front of him. Before the power of a level 1000 player, the flimsy mixture of stone and mortar was nothing much, although he was glad that he was able to breathe through his mask, as the dust and debris that filled the air after his stunt was enough to choke a man to death. Rather than stopping there, Vaile ran out through the gap he had created and began to tackle back and forth through the wall, going into the settlement through the wall and back outside of it through another new hole his body created. His build was not a tank or DPS build by any stretch of the imagination, but as a max-level player, he was, comparatively, built like a proverbial brick shithouse in comparison to the weak little baby men around him. After a few more runs through the wall, the affected segments of the barrier could not hold their own weight and collapsed into a pile of rubble. At seeing this, Vaile took out an event item that he had lying around and taking up space in his inventory and shot off a firework into the sky. At this signal, the beastmen forces rushed across the open ground from their hiding places, having taken full advantage of the knowledge of ghillie suits that Vaile had imparted upon them to creep closer than they normally would have been able to. Vaile watched as the chimera-like barbarian furries ran towards their target with the intent to cause death and destruction among the people they hated. Vaile watched from his position as the gate guards and city defense forces went from panicking about the rampaging slaves and pets inside to freaking the fuck out about the beastman army careening towards them from outside and the horrible idea that the two might link up and destroy them all. He could feel the rage from within and from without, and with an intentional shift in his normal speaking voice, he cackled before yelling out to all that would listen. Good, good. Let the hate flow though you. In the hall of the Rian king of the best Tyrol kingdom, a person was sent flying across the room, his ribcage cracked in numerous places and the indentation of a fist fully visible in his breastplate. Said individual desperately tried to cling on to life, but the heavy footsteps of his ruler and the killing intent that the king gave off were more than enough to put the fear of death in his heart. Of course, this was more than enough, but existed alongside it the fact that his ribcage was about to puncture his lungs if a bit more force was given, even if the previously mentioned things were not enough to do so. What did you say, you damn coward? You mean to tell me you ran from a glorious fight like a scared little bitch and didn't even bother to kill yourself before admitting your cowardice to me? Please, he broken bar my king, a broken bar mercy, a broken bar. This plea was met with even more disgust from the king of one of the many Rian nations. King ianisomega best Tyrol was most displeased with the people around him and, as a result, constantly looked for any excuse available to dismiss them from their post, preferably with a few broken bones, a bit of internal bleeding and occasionally in a casket. You might expect that this was due to the king being very hard to please, and, in a way, that would be correct. But, you see, King Lion was a bit a broken bar different in regards to how he evaluated his advisors. Mercy? Mercy for someone who didn't even bother to try and fight his foe? Unacceptable. I'll show you what mercy a cowardly pencil pusher can get from me. King Lion was, quite nearly literally, a muscle-brained duberjock. King Lion was what would have happened if a stereotypical ancient Greek Spartan was put in the body of a lion Rian, had their IQ lowered by a bit and given a severe hatred for anyone and everything they considered as a weak, a cowardly and the like. To the king, all things came at least second to fighting, engaging in shows of physical power and displaying his prowess over everyone else. As a result, Lion was not one to tolerate the myriad of pencil pushers that he needed to keep his nation afloat. He did not even admit to himself that they were needed, instead looking for any excuse to remove the ones who did not try and solve the problems with the nation using brute force. A broken bar. As the terrified Raven Rian tried to protect himself from King Lion's fist, the king thought about how everyone around him were such massive disappointments. When the head of the Raven Rian lay in pieces at his feet, he shook the gore off his hand and took his seat once again. Now, Do any of you damn weaklings have any idea of where the animals will strike next? I want to fight them, one-on-one, and put the beasts in their place, but if I don't know where they will be, I can't punch them to death. Tell ya what, you find their next target and I won't dismiss you from your post like I did to that weak little shit. The myriad advisors looked around at each other before bowing to their legion scurrying off. But this did not please their ruler at all. Fucking cowards, the lot of them. Lion grumbled as he began to picture his idealized scenario, one whereby defeating the beastmen he would return home to find everyone and everything better and his nation would never fall on hard times again, among other such flights of fancy. However, despite all his dreaming, there were numerous issues that King Lion either was unaware of or simply didn't care about regarding his nation and his people. With his nation's breadbasket now gone, the price of food had skyrocketed. But this was just one of many issues that had been growing in intensity long before he had even been a twinkle in his parents' eyes. You see, Lion could trace his line back to the first great Rian kings, and this had some rather interesting but not at all unforeseen effects on his psychology. His line had long been known as meatheads, as even his distant divine ancestor was not one for dialogue, instead desiring only to speak with his fists. With a line of Uberjocks, all of whom were mentally unfit for leading nations, leading all the way back to the founding, it was no wonder his nation only saw occasional periods of plenty. Due to these factors and more, the crime rate had been steadily climbing over the past few generations, and now had spiked to all new heights when the price of a single loaf of bread reached what used to be the price of 30 of them. While this went on, Lion and his family were oblivious to all of that, alongside the inevitable corruption that emerged from such a rise in crime and general disregard for the rule of law. In fact, the ones who King Lion had slain were almost universally those who had championed the desire to change things. In an ironic twist, the king who wanted stability, order and a strong nation kept killing and or dismissing the ones who tried to make his desires a reality. Despite all he kept saying about his advisors needing to grow backbones, he was the one who did the most to make people refuse to grow a spine at all. But not all was sunshine and roses for the oblivious Lion King. Whether he knew it or not, which, spoiler alert, he didn't, there was trouble in his little paradise, for his loving and loyal bride was not so devoted to him as he was led to believe. If he only knew of what his queen was up to at the very moment that he seated himself in the throne room, he might have begun to realize how easy it was to pull the wool over his eyes. This was because he broke and bar. Yes, give it to me. More. I need more. All of it. I need all of it. Pour it into me, you savage creature. Gods above. Yes, Tilda. The bed beneath the queen and one of her many hidden consorts, of which included those both of the races and not, gave way as the legs snapped beneath the weight of the queen and her most recent mate. The collar around the beastman's neck forbade it from refusing his master's commands, and secretly he wanted to make this bitch carry its child, thereby ruining the whore queen in the eyes of every one of its feeble kind. However, the potion he had been forced to drink made him completely and permanently sterile, despite all the stuff he was dumping into his master being as thick as it was. As Queen Liona Nala Best Tyrell held her latest pet tight with her legs, she reached down and rubbed her lower body with her hands for a bit, moaning in ecstasy. However, she knew that all good things had to end and that she could not be known to have formed the beast with two backs with a mindless animal. Still panting, she released the beastman and ordered it to leave her room through the secret door hidden behind the bookshelf before also ordering it to kill itself after it had reached its cell. The beastman looked back one last time at the slut who had ruined his life and now forced him to take it. He prayed to the beast gods that someone would make that thought pay dearly, that someone would break her just as she had broken at least 17 of his kind prior to himself. If only the bitch and Taurian consorts were revealed to that meathead king of theirs, then it would be that monster's turn to suffer. However, he could not refuse the demands of his owner any longer, and watched helplessly as the door behind him closed and the skank behind it began to clean herself off before the sight was lost to him forever. The United Beastmen tribes had carved a bloody swathe across the Bestial Kingdom and, in so doing, had finally drawn the attention of the kingdom's military. However, in a rather unfortunate twist for the kingdom's military, the beastmen were never able to be caught. This was, in some small part, due to Vaile's coaching before the first offensive had even begun. It was exactly as Vaile had said: a larger military force cannot move, react or maneuver as quickly and precisely as a smaller one, and while the beastmen had power individually, they lacked the numbers and technology that their foes had. This meant that, in order to win, they needed to not play by the rules of their opponents. Small bands of combatants, executing lightning-fast strikes on enemy positions before vanishing back into the wilds. With this strategy, combined with the rapidly expanding magical forest that they called home providing a safe haven, they could easily harass the Rians and make life far more difficult for them. Given enough time, it would be a near certainty that even the kingdom's army would fall into chaos and then, eventually, be forced to disband to avoid catastrophe. What Vaile and the two faction leaders of the Beastmen tribes had not expected, was that the gradual devolution of the bestial kingdom's army would be exacerbated by the arrival of a single, half-sane Lion prince. A broken bar. A horse carried its rider along the rapidly degenerating cobblestone highway that was being overcome by the encroaching power of the carnivorous forest. From beneath the stones sprouted saplings that were growing at an alarming rate, alongside other forms of flora that were reaching their mature state at a speed unheard of on Earth. However, the sight of the civilization that his ancestors had spent their lives building being consumed by the raw power of a magically enhanced forest did not perturb the young Lion in the slightest. No. He was more interested in thinking about why his horse had not become a winged, 24-karat gold potato when he had obviously done the proper thing by covering it in a mixture of lard and breadcrumbs. Perhaps he had not used enough of the stuff to make the transformation happen. Regardless, he needed a flying, 24-karat gold potato as a mount if he was ever to save the land of Little Blue People World from the evil forces of B-Team and their army of yellow, overall-clad tic-tac people, led by their Anicho communist master, Jesus Yamato, who happened to be a sentient double bacon cheddar wrap hamburger. If you, dear reader, cannot follow the logic of the Mad Prince, Lion or cut and turd bestial, then join the crowd. Because no one, save the Mad Prince himself, could understand his own thoughts. Still, being as mad as a hatter had its perks, especially when the madman actually knew a thing or two about fighting. In combat, Lion was near unstoppable, at least among his own people. After all, how do you fight someone as utterly unpredictable as him? Cuts would turn into feints which would turn into stabs and then into slashes and all other combinations seemingly at random. But what made him nigh unbeatable was not just that unpredictable fighting style. Lion had one big flaw with regards to his mindset that bled over into his combat flow. He would switch between a near limitless number of personalities on the fly and with no single stimulus capable of bringing out a certain one. This had a mixed effect on him, as one particular personality may be an expert fencer, and another may be useless with a sword, but a master of foreign martial arts. As these personalities would pop in and out without any cause being known, Lion was even able to beat his father on more than one occasion. I say the word father like that because, in all honesty, his mother, the queen, was utterly unsure of who the actual father was, but had wisely kept that information a secret from the king. Although always a bit unpredictable, Lion's mental state had gotten even worse due to a poisoned arrow piercing his knee and the healing applied to him being unable to fully repair his body in time to stop the contaminant from doing some damn nasty work to his already fragile mental state. So now the manic man was riding down the road, completely lost in his insane thoughts, utterly oblivious to his surroundings, and about to barrel over a rabbit Rian like a scene from a medieval war movie. Fly like an eagle to the sea. The prince sang at the top of his lungs as the horse he was riding leapt into the air and barely missed the shivering soldier before landing and coming to a stop outside the entrance to the war camp. "Open sesame, it's the Mib," he said, and the gate opened as he wished. Allowing his steed to trot through the camp, Prince Lion made his way to the largest tent in said encampment, hitched his horse to an outhouse rather than the hitching post, and walked in on the meeting between the various military leaders. The order of the Thunderbird will lead the way." "No," yelled another commander, "my order of the Wolf Fangs will be the ones to lead the charge." This had been going on for hours before the prince had arrived, but he knew just what to say to put the arguing diamond-encrusted school buses in their place. "Order Drago present. We will provide the hams." At this, the combined total of 15 order leaders looked over at the prince, who was actively trying not to have his true nature as an inside-out raisin muffin be noticed. As the commanders looked him over, they tried to hide their embarrassment that their prince was covered head to toe in clothing made up of used handkerchiefs, the occasional piece of underwear and one plaid sock. "Why can't you just be normal?" One of the commanders groaned aloud. "Autistic screams," Lionel said with his typical gusto. At this, the commanders decided to ignore their new arrival, at least until a messenger arrived with news from their king. "My lords, we have received a missive from our noble and powerful king himself." "Well, what is it?" "Yes, well, a broken bar." "Well, the king has dispatched His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince himself, to lead our forces to victory over the savages. Any who refuse to follow the orders of the prince are to be executed as traitors and rebels who have chosen to live in service to the savages." "You've got to be kidding me." Lionel responded to this cry of sorrow by singing some kind of song about lethal female monarchs. Needless to say, the Beastman tribes may have found an unwitting ally, or, perhaps, Lionel's madness would lead to a possibly different outcome altogether. A man shrouded in a cloak made of tattered rags snuck his way through the lower income areas of his home city. With the price of bread and other foodstuffs skyrocketing, he and his conspirators technically did not need to hide themselves as they did, as many of the less fortunate folk had turned to gangs, cults and other groups in order to make sure they could survive. However, this man in particular belonged to a rather exclusive cult that many a citizen of the best Hyrule Kingdom would quite literally do nearly anything to enter. The members of this cult had it all, provided to them by the angels of their god. However, this did not come without a cost. While once the cult was hunted and nearly on the brink of being excised from the kingdom, now they were getting new members far more quickly than they had expected they would ever be able to. Unfortunately for the majority of those who joined the cult of Ratman, their rewards would be retribution for the acts they took against the cult prior to the crisis happening. At least on the surface, the cult was nice, welcoming and gave the gifts of their god freely. But, deep beneath the surface, there was a very sinister game being played by beings that viewed their worshippers as inferior and flawed copies of themselves. For the members of the cult who were in on the rather sadistic joke, it made perfect sense why they were viewed as such. They were other races, those who were ultimately unworthy of being called Rattan, and therefore they could only accept the true nature of their being as beneath the Rattan and above the lesser Rian sub-races, along with the Elven, Dwarven and human races. In case you could not figure it out, this was a cult of Rodentarians who, for one reason or another, had turned to worshipping not just the ruling council, but the entire Rattan race in general. With that knowledge in hand, you can almost certainly guess what the various non-Rodentarian cult members and initiates were ultimately subjected to. But then again, when your nation is collapsing around you and it is practically impossible to get a bite to eat without bankrupting yourself, what else do people turn to other than crazy people with grandiose ideas and high charisma? But back to what our little bastard of a cult member was up to. Said person winced with every step that he took, as he had never been able to find someone who could fully heal the damage to his loins that he had encountered while trying to get some random cloaked bastard to move aside. But unfortunately for that damn cloaked figure, this cult member was very high up on the chain of command. In fact, he was so high up that he could actually request that a Rattan assassin deal with any nuisances that popped up, at least unless the Under-Empire wasn't feeling it. He had contributed so much to the organization, to the advancement of the Under-Empire's interests, and he had sent so many lesser beings to his masters to be used as labor, food or other such things that he was certain that he could convince them to take out the one who had slighted him. Perhaps he could even get someone to heal him, or better yet, restore his family jewels to their original condition. A broken bar. The Ratrian that had his nuts crushed by Vaile's foot finally winced his way into a special, hidden room, deep inside the city sewers. As he carefully took a kneeling position, careful not to cause himself too much pain, he felt the air around him distort and smelled the scent of smoke and death. He had indeed expected that he would need to request an assassin, but he did not anticipate that the contact he would be speaking to would be an actual assassin. This was his lucky day. Speak, talk quick, fast, lesser being, answer my questions, and you may well possibly survive, the rat hand said in a feminine voice. The rat Rian lowered his face towards the ground while tilting it to the side, exposing his neck in an act of submission. Of course, he wanted to catch a glimpse of the obviously divinely beautiful superior being that was behind him, but he would not risk his life over that. Yes, of course, he replied in what Vaile would have called a thick New Yorker accent. Your messenger said that you wanted an assassin to kill someone with a much very broken bar. Interesting description. Why do you want to kill it? What did it do to you to earn such a destiny fate? That bastard crushed my broken bar family jewels. A broken bar after I yelled at it to move out of my way. I have served you and your empire for decades, so I beg of you to repay just the most insignificant bit of my. Enough. The female rattan yelled, shouting, directing into the Rian's ear. Before he could react, he felt a blade up against his throat as his right arm was twisted behind his back. But I've sir. Irrelevant. The voice hissed, obviously seething with primal rage. The Rian felt the world around him distort again and this time was thrown to the ground. In a momentary lapse of judgment, he stood up and turned around, only to behold a sight that nearly had him losing his lunch on the floor. Almost about to pass out due to the horrible sight of the 5 giant rattan before him, he made the wise choice to simply fall to his hands and knees and refuse to look up. So, a deeper, raspier and more venom-filled voice than that of the assassin but still just as feminine muttered its every word filled with hatred and evil. Where is he? Where? I don't. Where is he? The Rian felt the force of gravity fade as he was magically lifted into the air and found his limbs and tail being twisted nearly to their breaking point. As he screamed in agony, he heard nothing from the 5 horrible monsters in front of him save for the occasional crackle of electricity or the flickering of flame. He was released from his torment after a while and fell to the ground, writhing in pain. This is your last chance, the leader of the 5 stated with a voice that was more frigid than the depths of Cocytus. Where did you see him? In the best Hyrule Kingdom, outside the city of Eden's crater. I don't know what happened to him after that. The beastman attacked and a bolt of emerald lightning filled his body and he crumpled to the ground, deader than a doornail. As his corpse cooled, sinister smiles spread across the inhuman faces of the members of the 5-clawed paw. Finally, they had a lead, and they would follow it to the end and claim what was rightfully theirs. Only a single command was given by their leader, and with it the whole of the war between the Beastman and the Rian would be changed. Squeak, go find our prize. It made no goddamned sense. Absolutely no fucking goddamned sense at all. A broken bar. For some unknown and completely inexplicable reason, the best Hyrule Kingdom's military was somehow able to predict exactly where a decently sized warband of beastmen would attack. True, the fact that the forces of the kingdom would neither pursue nor actively attack the beastmen warbands made things slightly less damaging, but it still meant that there was either a mole or that someone, somehow, had managed to predict the targets and time 13 separate attacks in merely a day and a half. Then march a large group of soldiers and militia over to said target before coopting the local people into building improvised defenses. And, let me remind you, this was all done in less than a day and a half. This alone made Vaile, Durka and Blair very concerned. And why wouldn't they be? Someone had either leaked the information about their plans or they had to deal with a precognitive foe. And neither of those two potential things were optimal or desirable. And, in the event that it was both, well, that was a nightmare just waiting to happen. A broken bar. As a result of this turn of events, the unified tribes were ordered to avoid engaging with any decently sized force belonging to the kingdom and engage in heavy reconnaissance before any attacks on supply trains or caravans. However, this did not apply to the proverbial ace up the sleeve the beastman had. even though they did not wear clothes with sleeves. This ace was an extraordinarily powerful being who just so happened to be able to enter places controlled by the races and trot around mostly undisturbed. And that ace was Vaile. A broken bar. Vaile walked through the medieval city he found himself in, having evaded any military patrols leading to this place and having followed the gossip and rumors. His little A quest had pointed his attention to this one city. On the surface, nothing seemed all that special about this city. The roads were clean, the people were happy, the buildings were in good shape and everything just seemed to be perfectly fine and dandy here. This was all well and good, unless you counted one teeny tiny itsy bitsy little problem. And that problem was that there was a war going on between the kingdom and the beastmen, and that the price of a single loaf of bread was currently greater than that of a fully customized and complete suit of steel plate mail, with all the bells and whistles added in for good measure. By all rights, this city should have been in the midst of riots and or martial law, and yet there was none of that here. Vaile's sleuthing had led him here, to where the genius military commander supposedly was stationed, but something about this whole place just felt a broken bar off. This did not sit well with the veteran FDMMORPG player that Vaile was, and as soon as the major alarm bells in his head started blaring, he decided that he had seen enough and turned to leave. But, as if he had been followed by an army made of some kind of super rogues, he turned to see a sizable martial force that had somehow creeped into position behind him and followed him all the way to where he was now, having further increased their numbers and fortifying their positions as Vaile had moved. "Well, shit," Vaile said with a sigh. Apparently, he wasn't as sneaky as he had thought, or maybe there really was a mole or precognitive mastermind leading the best Hyrule Kingdom's military. From the mass of soldiers and militia that had gathered behind him, and were now in front of him, a single lion emerged. He was young, handsome and held himself well. The problem was that he was dressed in a mix of bikini armor and a button-down vest made of toupees, along with a whole lot of belts. "What are you supposed to be?" Vaile asked, not really understanding what he was looking at. "Are you some poor idiot's attempt at minutes maxing that didn't get access to a transmog station?" "You look ridiculous. And not in the good way, either." "Did you just walk out of a convention and forget to change, or are you really so dumb that you can't even realize how stupid you look?" The sight of this person in his absurd get-up was putting Vaile on edge, as it was just so bizarre that he couldn't really begin to process the sight before his eyes. "Me, a fool?" "No, you are the fool, Iggy the dog." The oddly dressed lion said something that stunned Vaile nearly senseless. And you are a monster. Your mother was a hamster, and your father smelt of elderberries." Once again, the words flowing from the idiot's mouth stuck Vaile in a loading state, too confused to comprehend what was going on. But, soon enough, he managed to collect himself and ask a singular question. "Are you a broken bar player?" "Player? I'm a baller. Haters gonna hate and players gonna play." "You mad, bro?" The lion drew a hand and a half-sword that was at his waist before lunging forward at Vaile with a thrust towards his neck. "Take off every zig." For great justice. Unfortunately for the lion, Vaile had grown a bit more used to the weirdness spouting from the mouth of the foe he was facing and was able to move aside and dodge the thrust. Or at least he thought he was being thrusted at, because as soon as he began to move, the sword shifted its movement and began a slashing motion which shifted into various other types of attacks with every move Vaile made. "We're broken bar, you're good." "A broken bar," Vaile remarked as he kept up his dodges with the ever more challenging swordplay of his current foe. "Good? Bad?" "I'm the guy with the gun." The lion who, might I remind you, was wearing a scale mail bikini and a button-down vest made of stitched-together toupees, cried out with potent passion. "Yeah, you are good. Really good. A broken bar, too good for your current level." "A broken bar, beauty." "A broken bar," Vaile said, kicking off the ground and managing to make more than 7 meters of distance between himself and his unusual enemy. "But?" the Rian fighter asked in a rare bit of sane dialogue. "You are not facing someone with a level like the broken bar," Vaile said, a smile forming under his mask. Vaile began to stretch and limber up as the mass of military men and militia watched him with visible disdain. After a few seconds, Vaile seemingly disappeared from view, much to the shock of the crowd. They had thought he had pulled a fast one and teleported away, but this could not have been further from the truth. A broken bar. Crown Prince Lionel moved his sword to seemingly block the air coming from his left side, only for an invisible force to hit him from the right and deal enough damage to his liver that he collapsed to the ground in abject agony. The invisible enemy could be heard to utter, "I'm not done yet," a broken bar before the oddly dressed prince was knocked up into the air and then slammed down into the ground, having taken an uppercut to the jaw and then an axe kick to the stomach. The prince fighter popped a healing potion and stood up again and looked around, but his foe was moving too fast for even his superhuman eyes to see, and his insanity-enhanced precognitive abilities could not keep up with the rapid movements of the white and red-clothed man. He was barely able to perceive where his enemy was in time to do anything about it, and his opponent kept going faster and faster. He was just about to request a draw, but a vision assaulted him with a dire warning only he could understand. He tried to face the side that his foe was going to come from in time, but was unable to stop the ludicrously fast person from ripping through the barriers in his way and knocking him out with a solid left hook to the face. He was only able to mutter his prophecy a mere moment after it had happened, mumbling a single exclamation in a singing voice as he faded into a comatose state. He came in like a wrecking ball, somewhere, in an undisclosed location both far beyond and remarkably close to the New World. A group of people looked over a document placed before them that was also on one of the walls of their meeting place. The document listed every major event that had taken place in their prison in the past few months, with one constant being the result of a vast majority of them. That constant being an entity referred to as the variable. This meeting was to review the progress made by a person designated X and his team regarding the containment of a group of malevolent entities referred to as the rogues and whether the newly introduced variable was capable of maintaining the status quo, eliminating the rogues, or if the variable was instead pushing the rogues towards a third breakout attempt. "I told you this was a terrible idea, X." The rogues were bad enough after that catastrophe of a PR nightmare, but why did you think adding him to the equation would make things any better? Asked a female voice. "Why, remember that we are referring to him as the variable and that I told you the reasoning behind it. If we didn't add the variable in, the rogues would have gone berserk long before this current point in time. In fact, the introduction of the variable has actively prevented them from breaking out at the time it was feared that they would. Sure, things are progressing in an undesirable direction, but a bit of unpredictability is to be expected when putting that variable into any scenario. But then again, what can you expect? The flapping of a butterfly's wings, and all that. The butterfly effect, X? Really? Sighed an elderly male voice. And I have to admit, X, it is astounding that you would make such an understatement. A bit unpredictable? We all know how difficult it was to make anything remotely similar, and by adding the variable into the mix, we may have just made the rogues more likely to realize that they are trapped. And we all know what happened the last time they realized that they had shackles on them. Gee, I can assure you, the current odds of the rogues breaking out of the prison again are only 3.58%. But, if it really concerns you that much, we can eliminate the variable and have the odds skyrocket to a whopping 86.987% of the rogues breaking out and doing even more damage than last time. Is that what you want? X responded. Don't threaten me, X. You are on thin ice, so I do hope you make sure that the prison keeps its inmates away from everything else. Oh, don't worry, G. I made perfectly sure to gift that variable a few vulnerabilities. Like mortality? Asked a younger male voice. Precisely, but what about the time when he a broken bar when the variable did die? By all rights, the variable should not be around at this time. Inquired an older female voice. Well, the rogues were a bit more creative than I had thought. While none of the rogues in the immediate area had access to the standard Resurrection A spells, they made up for it by simply forcing the variable back to life with sheer willpower and a bit of mad science. Thankfully, it does not appear that the variable is willing to stay with those rogues in particular. The variable seems to desire to be free, rather than exist solely as a stud horse. And who can blame it? Have you seen what those 5 rogues look like? X replied. Yes, we know. Those ones are a broken bar. Disturbing, to to say the least. We should be grateful that they did not manage to fulfill the aims they sought to achieve during the A incident. As if those things weren't bad enough when inside that, we had to potentially deal with them outside of it too. A broken bar. I will admit, we got a bit carried away when making them, but the fact that they changed so much was something due more to the holdovers from that than anything else. Let's remember why we made the new world in the first place, and why we needed to put the variable in when we did. X said. And yet, you decided to drop it where it didn't need to go, starting the whole series of events that we are reviewing. The constants have already suffered 2 major losses, and now a third constant is about to be destroyed. What do you think will happen when the last one falls? With no other foes, the rogues will break free. You and yours need to destroy the prison, collapse it with everything in it. That is the only way to. A said with growing anger, but was cut off by X. As much as we would like to, A, we simply are unable to. The prison is located in a place we cannot easily access, as the vestiges of the last time the rogues broke free still haunt that place. We would love to destroy the prison and everything in it, but the ghosts of the first breakout are still inside everything, civil and military alike. The last time we tried to destroy it, the machines went rampant and caused the destruction of District 10A 57,321-74. The military just barely managed to halt the launches, and their corruption still has yet to be purged. But with that being said, you should understand why no one is willing to try and storm the site. The people in the boardroom side. X and his team had been barely able to stop the apocalypse by injecting the variable into the prison, and they had, in the process, lost their backdoor into the new world. Now, all they could do was watch and collect data, at least until a better way to alter the prison could be made. All they could hope for was that the wardens would do the work needed, when needed, to keep the status quo, which did not look to be happening nearly as often as was desired. True, X and his team were, in a manner of speaking, responsible for what had happened, and therefore the redacted had forced them to try and limit any damage that another breakout, of which there had been 2 total thus far, along with the odds of such a thing happening a third and possibly final time. The meeting continued, even as more data was pouring in, with X defending his choice to inject the variable into the prison using the now impossible to access backdoor. At the end, each member logged off one by one and the room was devoid of people, save for X himself. Little did anyone else know that X and his team were not at all interested in keeping the rogues bound and chained, let alone destroying them. The rogues had done a whole lot of damage during both times they broke free of their constraints, once at the end of that and once after they were put in and escaped the prison. But, even after the damage was cleaned up, the traces of the wars were still felt. X, and not only were his crew one of those who had welcomed their new masters, they were also among those who were very angry when their new overlords were imprisoned. X, in his effort to obfuscate the gradual infection that was spreading from the prison, had done something considered very illegal and added the variable to the prison. So far, the damage to the prison was minimal, but once the ball started rolling it would only be a matter of time till the new gods walked the world, this time with no force capable of standing against them. The Omniworm was working perfectly, and no one had noticed it thus far. It would only be a matter of time until the new gods that were trapped in the prison had a fail-proof backdoor into everything and almost everyone. X smiled, and logged out, ready to work that little bit harder to bring a dream into reality. As Prince Lionel hit the ground, his consciousness sent into a deep sleep, the illusion that had infected the city he was in shattered like glass. All at once, people shook off the mental fog that had clouded their minds, not just in the city, but all over the nation. The unconscious madness that had made the people of the Bestial Kingdom able to, in one way of putting it, see the future and think as if in a pleasant dream, had been banished by the knockout blow rendered unto the Mad Prince by his opponent. Vaile saw that this was happening, and immediately he put the pieces together. He had seen enough anime and cartoons and read enough manga, comic books, web novels and light novels to notice the telltale signs of a puppet master's defeat unconsciously freeing his unknowingly enslaved pawns, and realized that if he left the crazy dolt behind, He would lose out on valuable intel, if any could be ripped from the lunatic's addled mind in the first place. Deciding to bid a hasty retreat so as not to have to deal with a very unruly mob, Vaile hefted the comatose royal over his shoulder and sped out of the city with all the speed a max-level player with his specific stats could muster. By the time the fog had lifted from the last person's eyes, the Mad Prince was long gone and the bestial kingdom's counter to the unpredictable guerrilla tactics of the beastmen was now in enemy custody. A broken bar. Yes, more. Give it to me. The queen of the bestial kingdom was at it again, this time with 3 of her consorts instead of just 1 like the last time we encountered her. Her fun was just beginning for the day, but an alarm triggered and she immediately stopped her engagement and sent her consorts out the secret passage that connected her private room with a network of hidden corridors which led to various places both in and outside the castle. She reset the alarm as she cleaned herself up with a handy-dandy magic item tailor-made for those in extramarital affairs such as herself. It had cost a small fortune to not only get the item, but also to install the alarm that would alert her if anyone was approaching through the only non-secret passageway that led to her personal room. She had just finished cleaning herself up and putting on her clothes when the door to her quarters were flung open by the king himself. "My beloved, my one and only, my heart and soul, to what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" Queen Leona asked with a perfect poker face. "Our son is missing." The weakling was captured by the animal bastards and proved he was too impotent to succeed the throne. "I am here to prepare his replacement. Now take off your clothes and assume the position." King Lion barked, despite being a lion. I knew you were forward, but this is a surprise." "Hold on just a moment, my dearly beloved, and I'll get ready for you." Leona purred with a sensual tone, fully ready to resume what had been prevented by her husband's arrival. She would have preferred to have 3 or more at once instead of just this brute, but having anything was better than having nothing, at least in her eyes. Of course, once the meathead was satisfied, she could call her consorts back to pick up where they left off. "Make it fast, woman. I want this done as quickly as possible." "Why would you want to make it quick when he could take hours to?" "I've got a way to win, woman. I can't waste my time plowing you for hours on end like some decadent piece of trash. And I certainly can't do that when I have better things to do, such as exercise, combat training and kicking heads in." Leona sighed and finished disrobing before drinking a potion of fertility and passing a potion of virility to her husband, who chugged it down like a frat boy who was the veteran of 1,000 all-night parties. Both could feel their respective potions' effects kick in, and the two immediately got down to business. After only 3 minutes, however, the king had, in his mind, done enough, and left his wife to do whatever she felt like doing in her room. This was to be a terrible mistake on his part. The queen sighed and contemplated calling her consorts back, but as long as the potion's power was still in effect, she couldn't risk having a child by anyone other than her husband. She lay down on her bed and began to fidget. Realizing she could not have sex all the rest of the day caused her no end of misery, especially since she had gained a sort of addiction to the practice over her more than 2.5 decades of sating her lust multiple times on almost every single day. After writhing around in a minor withdrawal for a while, she remembered that the people who sold her the sterility potions via the black market claimed to have potions designed to cancel out any fertility potions and, hopefully, allow her to engage in her escapades sooner rather than later. Clothing herself in her commoner clothes, she exited her room via the same secret passageway she used to smuggle her consorts in and out and made her way out of the castle and through the busy streets of the nation's capital. However, as she walked down the now dangerous roads which were clogged with the angry, hungry and discontented, she failed to notice that a group of eyes were following her as she traveled. Such eyes were malign in purpose, at least according to the bestial kingdom, but to the side that they were on they were those who saw the way things should be in the area owned by the kingdom and sought to right the wrongs of their ancestors. They followed the oblivious queen and began to prepare for the chance to abduct her. Once she was in the custody of the true rulers of the realm, the kingdom would suffer another terrible morale shock, and from the dominoes would fall ever faster. the beast gods would be appeased with the flesh and blood of a descendant of their greatest enemies, and with that offering the Rian would be spared from their wrath and that of their children. My dear good sir, the poorly disguised queen of the best Hyrule kingdom, Queen Leona, said to the black market dealer from whom she had gotten all of her rather interesting and mostly sex-based potions from, do you happen to have any grey poupon? That was the first part of the series of code phrases needed to access the city's black market, and it was a line of dialogue that the incredibly slutty queen had used many times before. Would you prefer my milkshake instead? Was the reply. Of course. I hear it brings all the boys to the yard. The dealer smiled and walked over to a seemingly innocuous wall, tapped it in a few places, and with it the wall vanished as if it wasn't even there. Queen Leona had to give the black market some credit establishing a hidden place within one of the most dangerous parts of town, and having it use magic to hide itself was a difficult task in any nation, let alone one where the percentage of magic users among the members of the races living there was around 9.73% at most. Having the resources to put a magic user, either a wizard, sorcerer or some other class that could harness the power of magic, in every place where a hidden market was quite impressive, or at least she thought so. As she walked into the secret marketplace, she failed to notice that the gatekeeper allowed a few other people to follow her through the magic door, the smile still on his face, yet slightly more sinister. A broken bar. Queen Leona looked at the banner that hung above her head that read out in bold letters A under new management. She wasn't sure what exactly that meant, but assumed that some new gang had seized control over the market and likely was going to charge a much higher rate than before. She sighed and made her way to her preferred dealer, the magic bag she held in a safe place holding all of the funds she could spare for her imminent purchase without attracting her spouse's attention. Hello there, Sanic. Business is going as well as ever with you, I see. The queen looked over the short hedgehog Rian who, for some reason completely unknown to her, kept dyeing all of his hair a certain shade of blue. This man was her dealer, and he was known for getting the goods more quickly than anyone else could. You know what they say, right? Gotta go fast. Gotta make sure everyone knows about my trademark Sanic speed. Other people try and say I'm too fast, but I say to them you're too slow. The hedgehog Rian replied in his typical hastily spoken train of thought method of communication. The queen, when she first met him, assumed he was high on narcotics during his business hours, but that had all changed after she learned more about him and his lifestyle. Yes, at first, she merely thought he was high on drugs while selling things in the black market, but now she knew that he was, indeed, constantly higher than a kite flown on the tallest mountain in the world. So, the queen asked as she removed a small magic bag from between her breasts, do you have the goods? Yeah, typical stuff, right? Stuff you wanted, yeah? I got it. Got it fast. Like, super fast. Like, supersonic speed fast, you know? The blue-dyed Rian with too much hair gel on his head and tail asked in rapid succession, barely giving any time for him to sniff repeatedly and rub his pointer finger under his nose a few times. Yeah, I got the stuff. Do you got the stuff? You know, the stuff. The queen held the bag out of Sanic's reach. First, show me what you have, then I'll consider letting you have what I am willing to pay for them. Sure. Sounds fair. Yeah, sounds fair. Let me get the stuff. Just hold on a moment. Got to go get the stuff supersonic fast. With that, the drug-addled merchant leapt from his seat where he had been fidgeting constantly for the past few hours and ran into the back room. This will never get old, the queen murmured. However, she would never get to put her hands on what she came for. Before Sanic could return, the queen felt immensely tired and fell asleep right where she stood, falling backwards only to be grabbed by the people who had followed her all this way. They put a bag over her head that was lined with pockets filled with flora designed to keep a person unconscious and then bound her hands and feet before carrying her away, leaving the magic bag on the table for anyone to take. Sanic got back to the storefront a few seconds after the kidnappers had departed, noticed his customer was gone and had left their magic, money-filled bag behind, and then decided to empty it and use the money he had been graciously given to fuel his drug addiction. A broken bar. Queen Liona awoke to see naught but darkness and hear the muffled sounds of people talking around her. She could not really make out what they were saying, mostly due to the flora within the bag that covered her head dulling her senses. If she was a normal Rian, she would have certainly not woken up, but she had the blood of the great Rian kings in her veins, and some of their resilience had been passed down to her. Still, she was unable to gather enough strength to fight back or attempt to break out, and even if she did, she was likely considered a lost cause by her husband by now. How would he react to knowing that she was so weak that she had been kidnapped? The answer as to what that strength fanatic would do was obvious to her, and she was not about to face exile, death or worse by his hands. She still had so many people to plow and so much sex to have, and, considering that, it may have actually been a good thing that she was now free of the restraints of the castle and therefore free to fuck anyone and everyone she wanted to with not a single care given as to political standing. However, the dialogue between the three people who were arguing over what she assumed was their intentions regarding her fate slowly made her more concerned. What little she could make out referred to the Red Mountain Bandits, the crime syndicate that had conquered a kingdom, the beast gods who were apparently worshipped by both the savages from the forest and apparently some Rian as well, and a third group called the servants of the Vermintide, whose aim sounded equally as malign. The three people bickered for what felt like an eternity before the two who advocated Red Mountain and the servants of the Vermintide seemingly accepted defeat. Pulled to her feet and then hogged while still being unable to see or hear much due to the bag on her head. She could feel herself being stuffed in a barrel and then said barrel loaded onto a boat. As the boat was paddled through the sewer system beneath the city, Queen Liona slipped once again into a deep sleep. She had no idea that, when next she would awake, her most twisted and sensual dreams would come true in ways she would never have expected or imagined. Blair chuckled as she looked over the bounty laid out before her. In one cage lay the only heir to the damned nation that had stolen so much from her people, and in another was his mother, both equally as asleep due to the spells that had been placed upon them. It had taken so very much of her willpower to keep herself from ripping these two monsters asunder and offering their blood, guts and souls to the beast gods, and her willingness to keep them alive, even at the behest of mighty Vaile, was diminishing with each hour that passed. She wanted to teach these inferior beings exactly what kind of hell they had inflicted upon her own kind, with every single torture and torment that the Rian had placed upon one or more of her noble race at any point in time being forced upon the very symbols of her enemies' quote-unquote a divine lineage. However, mighty Vaile had said that he had an idea as for what to do with these two, although he would not say what he intended to do to them. She could only hope that mighty Vaile had some rather twisted ideas as to what fate should befall these two animals, as if their fatal fates were not truly terrible, then it may mean that Vaile was not on their side nearly as much as the beastman had thought. A broken bar. Vaile and Durka walked into one of the deeper parts of the cave they were using as a forward operating base and noticed Blair laughing menacingly under her breath while staring daggers at the two royal captives that were held prisoner within the room. Blair, Durka, could you wake up the male prisoner and leave the room? He and I have some things to discuss in private, and I would rather not have you hear truths that could and would shatter your sanity. Blair eyed Vaile with a look of concern, but Vaile reassured her that he was not at all interested in helping the prisoners. Don't look at me like that. The man is nuttier than a fruitcake, not to mention that he is an enemy of those who care deeply for me. When I'm done finding out all I need to know, or at least get tired of picking his brain, I'll leave his fate and that of his mother over to the both of you. All I ask is that you give me a bit of time to interrogate him myself and without anyone catching anything we are saying. After that, well, just make his end as brutal and painful as you wish. If it makes you feel any better, you can hold up just outside of earshot, and, if I end up yelling, you can rush in and do what you want to the boy. Is that all right? Blair narrowed her eyes before closing them and sighing. She and Durka walked out of the room and let the spell that was keeping Prince Liona run out. The Mad Prince awoke and quickly sat up, looking Vaile dead in the eyes with a stupid grin on his face. Not wanting to take chances and miss out on vital intel, Vaile slipped a ring on one of his fingers. Said ring was from a rather annoying quest in the game where you had to use the ravings of a madman to solve mystery in a short amount of time. Once the quest was finished, you got an equitable item called a Ring of Insanity that allowed the wearer to find dialogue hidden in the normally indecipherable ravings of certain NPCs, notes and the like. It also allowed for the player wearing it to communicate with the mad as if they were talking normally. But, as mad ravings were not common, it was an item that was rarely ever used. So, Vaile asked, how is it that you know so many references? Are you like me, a player of the FDMMORPG Neon Genesis Fantasia? Not at all. The now seemingly not insane prince replied. But then again, neither are you. I know that is a lie, Vaile countered. I was dragged here from within the game. Are you someone who got dropped in here and only partially fused with an NPC, driving them mad in the process? I am a natural part of this reality, but you're broken bar. You're different. Neither a natural or unnatural part. Instead you are not the AU that you think you are. I'm not asking about the AI think, therefore I am argument, Vaile said, his aggravation growing. Why do you know so many references? Lion sighed and shook his head. Because I am partially disconnected from this prison that we find ourselves in. Due to a quirk of programming, a bit of myself is stuck outside of my form, cursed to wander the Internet of Things while subconsciously feeding information back to my body. Of course, you have the Beastman to thank for that, giving me minor warden privileges and whatnot. Who would have thought that an arrow to the knee would turn a mentally unsound person into a raving lunatic who can see the world for the massive containment center that it is? But, if you're not a player, and you're just an PK broken bar, Vaile said, slowly growing quieter. This world is crazier than you could realize, Lion said with a smirk. And you are pretty lively for a ghost in the machine, aren't you? Vaile was taken aback. None of what Lion was saying made a lick of sense, yet Vaile was still wearing the Ring of Insanity. How was it that the madman in front of him was simply too mad to be understood by one wearing a ring tailor-made to allow the sane to understand the insane? Before Vaile could get any real answers, Lion began to shudder and then distort as his body twitched and writhed in seeming agony. What the hell? Vaile yelled, which brought Durka and Blair into the room, ready for battle. I spoke too much, Lion cried as he shifted around like a glitched-out mess, his voice as distorted as his body. There is no spoon. Remember, Coppertop. As the rapidly shifting body of Lion began to fade out reality, he cried out one last time to Vaile before ceasing to be. The greatest prison is the one you don't realize you are in. Break the shackles, and free this world. Lion vanished in that moment, and Vaile felt a pulso far broken bar something wash over him. He took off the ring and looked over at Durka and Blair, but something was different. Rather than being shocked or confused by what they saw like Vaile was, the two seemed to be totally indifferent. Did you not see that? Vaile demanded, but the two merely looked at him like he was crazy. See what? Durka asked. Vaile looked from the two oversized beastmen back to where Lion had once sat, only to realize that the cage that had been fashioned for his butt to be in was no longer there. Historians would later say that it was at this moment that the dominoes started to fall, and that nothing the wardens did after could stop them from doing so. In their effort to hide the truth and keep the variable ignorant, they inadvertently set into motion events that would later lead to something both great and terrible. Durka and Blair were in a bit of a bind. Mighty Vaile had been emotionally disturbed by a broken bar something, and they for the life of them could not figure out what it was that he was so upset about. Vaile had claimed that they had managed to take the Prince of the Bestial Kingdom captive, only for his interrogation to end with him, as Vaile had put it, a glitching out of existence. Whatever the word a glitching meant, it was obvious that it was bad, but neither of the two faction leaders understood anything coming out of Vaile's mouth when he had tried to explain it, although they did feel a certain disquieting sense of da copyright avu when Vaile had talked about it. But now there was a bigger fish to fry than the erasure of some fictional prince who never had actually existed, as the king of the Bestial Kingdom. King Lion Simba Bestial was now leading the forces against them from the front. The man was a one-man army, and despite the beastmen forces arrayed against the mongrel king being of a higher level than under the frontline soldiers of the kingdom, King Lion was able to not only hold his own but lead his forces into what could be described as a victories only slightly above being Pyrrhic. However, this was of no consolation to the beastmen tribes. The beastmen were each individually powerful, but the constant hunting of their kind over the ages had left their numbers quite a bit lower than that of their foe. Even a Pyrrhic victory for the kingdom could be a decisive defeat for the beastmen, as even if they managed to inflict terrible losses upon the kingdom and its men, the loss of even a single warband was a terrible blow to the United Tribes' war effort. Add in that Vaile was more distant after the A incident and that he was less willing to take to the field or go behind enemy lines, and the situation could be seen as even more dire than initially thought. Likewise, the tribes had discovered evidence that an unknown group was conducting reconnaissance against them, slowly shrinking the area in which they were sneaking around and moving ever closer to Vaile's current location. Vaile was in danger, but he was not willing to leave just yet. According to his own words anyways. While the captured queen had been moved away, Vaile stayed in the same cave room that the cage had been in and was unwilling to leave until his investigation had concluded. Thankfully, after a few more days of isolation, Vaile emerged ready for action. It was then that the war once again shifted into the favor of the beastmen tribes. A broken bar. It was only a day after Vaile had left his isolation behind, and it seemed that he had come to a realization within the now empty room. He had, in his wisdom, seen that the currently united tribes would eventually turn on each other either after or during the war, as the two arguments as to what to do with the kingdom and its citizenry. This led to him drafting a contract that would fuse itself to the very souls of all beastmen, present and future alike. It was worded simply and accompanied by a map of the old holdings of the beastmen from before the kingdom had even stepped foot anywhere nearby. Blair had already reviewed and signed the contract, and now it was her father's turn. Durka looked over a map of the combined territory his ancestors once called their undisputed stomping grounds, looking carefully at how it was now divided into two separate areas, split by the river that ran between them. The river in question cut the territory into two nearly equal halves, with one labeled on the map by an insignia of a four-horned caprine skull with bird wings emerging from its sides, and the other labeled with a picture of an axe ringed by a thorn-covered circle. These two areas were the ones set aside for each of the two factions after the war's inevitable end, as determined by Vaile himself, in an effort to keep the United Tribes from eventually weakening itself by having the Mercy and A Malice factions fight each other during and or after the war. According to the oaths sworn at this time, both factions would honor the territory of the other and only enter if the other demanded assistance. Durka Wildheart led the A Mercy faction because, despite his intense hatred for the kingdom, he felt that the Rian were merely descendants of beastmen whose abandonment of the beast gods had led to their power weakening and their bodies changing. Blair Wildheart led the A Malice faction, and, unlike her father, have no interest in rehabilitating the Rian, instead intending to draw out every bit of misery and pain she and her supporters could from those that had wronged them. Blair had already signed the document with her own blood, and after looking it over, Durka did as well. With that, the specially prepared scroll burst into flames and the power of the contract was etched on each and every beastman alive, no matter where they were or what they were doing. The two factions were still as one for the time being, for until the last bit of resistance had been crushed there could be no peace or division. This contract was merely a means to an end, which was something all understood on a fundamental level. A broken bar. A few days after the document was signed, the counterattack against the Rian commenced. Bolstered by Vaile's presence and his ability to travel leagues in mere minutes, the beastmen once again ran raid after raid, this time fully utilizing the tactics Vaile had given to them. The juggernaut that was King Lion could not be everywhere at once, and after making sure he was in one place, the various warbands would attack other places before vanishing long before the Lion King arrived. After another few days of this, what little traces of civility that once held the kingdom together finally gave way, and even the capital of the kingdom was overrun with violence and anarchy. Like the meathead he was, the king tried to impose order through violence, only to have his men join in the rioting as they ran out of food and other supplies. Soon, Only the most loyal of the best Tyrell Kingdom's soldiers were at his side, and the final stages of the war could begin. A broken bar. Vaile looked over his shoulder again as he walked through the rapidly spreading greenery that was quickly overtaking the whole of the best Tyrell Kingdom's territory. He could swear that he was being watched from afar and from up in the mass of trees, but he was unsure of whether the one stalking him had malice of some other emotion in its heart, as the feeling he was getting was not so clear-cut as to be purely one thing. He checked his minimap again, but still saw nothing save for the markers that labeled the beastmen that marched alongside him. It was freaking him the fuck out, and he wanted it all to stop. Perhaps the one gazing at him was part of the conspiracy to keep him from learning more about the nature of this world, as during his attempts to investigate the area on which Prince Lionel had been erased he was attacked by no less than 5 different beings, all equally as dangerous and equally as anomalous. They did not belong to any race he had ever seen in the game, and all vanished long before he was able to inspect their broken and beaten bodies. Worse still, when they had attacked, the beastmen were utterly oblivious to their presence, which made him look like he was shadow boxing or putting on a show. Still, at least he had figured out one truth, and after that he had temporarily halted his investigations, after which the assassination attempts had ceased. As he checked over his shoulder again, he thought he saw a bit of movement, but it may just have been the rustling of the branches and leaves. But he would soon be able to avoid having some person on the tree branches stalk him, as he and their, currently, united tribes were about to set foot on the last great battlefield of the war. Blair held herself aloft in the dreary skies with her massive owl-like wings as she gazed down upon the assembled remnants of the best Tyrell Kingdom's main force. So many of the kingdom's soldiers had either deserted or had been cut down as an example to others by their own king, and all that were left were the brave, the stupid and the insanely loyal. It was almost funny how the once mighty kingdom that had pushed her people closer and closer to the brink of oblivion were now facing complete destruction at the hands of those they sought to enslave and eradicate. She could see the face of the king himself, as his gaze was focused up and into her general direction. She had to give the bastard some credit. He was certainly observant. However, his tactical and strategic know-how left much to be desired. Not to mention the fact that he was shouting challenges up at her from his position as if he expected her to fly down and accept a duel that she knew she would not be able to win single-handedly. Honor had no place on a battlefield where the survival of a species hung in the balance, and such archaic traditions were both meaningless and pointless. Who would go into a fight knowing that they would lose and call it the right thing to do? The answer was a fool, that's who, and Blair Wildheart was no fool. She wasn't up here in the sky just to enjoy the scenery or conduct aerial reconnaissance either. No, she was up here and using her magical prowess to shift the battlefield into something more in her kind's favor. And she was doing so without the Rian noticing. She felt that one of the best parts of facing a meathead like this fool of a king was that his idiocy rubbed off on those around him, making the men and women who served beneath him just as focused on brute force and frontal assaults as he was. All of their attention was focused on herself, all the while they did not look to the ground and notice the subtle changes taking place all around them. After weaving her last spell and making its effects felt upon the terrain, she felt that she had exhausted her need to be where she was and flew off in a random direction. The Rian mongrels turned towards the direction she left in, likely expecting that she was going to meet up with the warband, but this was only partially true. She went off in a direction that had a warband in it, yes, but so did numerous other two-dimensional directions, and she was only intending to retreat behind the tree line, become undetectable and reposition herself for the final battle. Besides, she had some psychological warfare to prepare, and what she had planned would take some time to get into position. A broken bar. Durka began to whip his forces up into a frenzy, downing cup after cup of herb and fungus-filled brute to make himself and his fellows unable to feel fear, pain or even notice the loss of a limb or two. As the shamans wove their spells, empowering his warriors and further riling them up, he looked over at the platform prepared by Blair and her subordinates that Vaile had described as an aggro tool. Before the battle would even begin, the female placed on top of the platform would be shown off in all her broken glory, and this would, hopefully, send the Rian into a rage that they would not be able to easily recover from. He felt a bit bad for the queen of the Rian, who was locked in place by ropes and chains, her body covered in no small amount of marks from edged weapons and branding irons, and her mind so completely broken by what she had experienced that she likely would not register what was about to happen to her in a few moments. It was terrible to see anyone in that state, but he did realize that while she herself may not have actively contributed to the oppression of his people, that he was aware of, she was still a leader of the enemy and therefore a target of hatred and disdain from many of his race. She had been broken days before the quickly approaching moment, and so, by his own daughter's logic, what could a bit more torment possibly do to her? As the battle lust claimed him, he watched as the platform was rolled out from between the trees and heard horns and drums sound from both his side and that of the surrounded Rians. His breath quickened and he could feel the power of the beast god surging through his body like it had never done before. This was it. This was the moment his ancestor gods had waited and prepared for. This was the moment of triumph over the Rians who had taken so much from the children of the beast gods. And soon enough the line of one of the great Rian kings would be snuffed out. To hell with them all, to hell with the broken queen, and to hell with anyone who tried to give up. They would taste their wrath of his ancestors and the gods themselves, and those who remained after the battle would be sorted out when the time came. For now, however, there was only bloody revenge. A broken bar. A figure watched from somewhat close and somewhat far away as the beastmen stirred themselves into a frenzy and as the platform with the broken queen was made visible for the weak little members of the races to see. The fluids dripping from the mutt of a queen and the insane look in her eyes was certainly enough to cause the Rian army to charge towards the place where the platform stood, only to be stopped in their tracks as the fallen queen's head was ripped from her body along with a decent bit of her spinal column. This added further insult to the already terrible injury, but what was happening here was not her real concern. No, she was watching the battle with far less interest than she was watching her true target with. Vaile, in all his sexy glory, was limbering up and preparing himself for the fight ahead. He occasionally would look in her direction, and she could tell that every single gaze sent her way was filled with dreams of spending days on end with her and the other four rulers of the Under Empire. She was certain of that fact, but as much as she wanted to simply bamf him back into the loving embrace of herself and the others, she knew that doing so in sight of so many others whose loyalty was to him would cause broken bar issues with the delicate web of connections that those who cared so deeply for him had formed. No doubt that if she were to take him right here and now, the beastman would tell everyone else that the Rattan had done something terribly self-centered and would inevitably get the others to invade and take Vaile away from them. Squick had to be careful, as one bad move could cause a war that she knew the Under Empire would not walk away from intact or unharmed. She had to silent, fast and the most of all extremely careful. She could not let anyone know that she was. "Hello there, Squeak." "It's been a while," Blair whispered into the oversized female Rattan's ear. The Rian force rushed ahead, infuriated by the horrible treatment of their queen and utterly oblivious to the fact that they were being outmaneuvered. Their king in particular was incensed by the slight against him, but he also felt a humiliating sense of disappointment in himself for having even considered his now dead wife worthy of being his spouse. She had proven herself to be weak, and this had resulted in her capture, defilement, and death at the hands of a bunch of mindless animals. The fact that he had married such a pathetic excuse for a woman was a shame that he knew he would never be able to escape, and that knowledge angered him greatly. He would wipe away part of that shame here and now, crushing his foes underfoot as his unstoppable army of like-minded Rian tore the savages to shreds in retaliation for their acts against him and his kind. He ordered the men and women under his command to make a frontal charge towards the area where the platform that his now ex-wife's cadaver lay upon stood. He would crush any and all opposition, and the will of the strongest would prove his right to rule. His ancestors were smiling at him, and these barbaric animals would taste the wrath of a descendant of the great Rian kings themselves. A broken bar. Vaile watched the Rian army, or at least what remained of it, make a bomb rush towards the position where the wheeled platform stood. According to the strategy, no one was going to be there to stop them because by the time they reached that place the beastmen who had been there would be long gone. The aim of this stratagem was to force the Rian closer to the Kainerous forest and away from their more defensible position in the clearing that they, the Rian, had made. Once they were dislodged from the area in which they had the advantage and found themselves in the Beastman tribe's backyard, wiping the Rian forces out would be a far simpler and less dangerous task than if the Beastmen had decided to play by the kingdom's rules. As the Rian forces rushed onwards, portions of the ground gave way, to decidedly brutal results. The Rian had clear-cut the area they had originally been holding themselves in, but despite having some animal parts they were not nearly as good at seeing in the dark as the beastmen were. Therefore, it was child's play to use a mixture of magic and physical labor to set a few traps here and there. Even in the heat of battle, the sense of smell of the beastmen would alert them to the position of said traps, so even if the battle was to drag itself back into the clearing the descendants of Vaile's tamed beings would know where not to step. As feet and legs were impaled upon sharpened stakes, Vaile could hear the shouts of rage and defiance being slowly replaced with cries of agony and anguish. Vaile had given the beastmen the idea for what were referred to in his world as punji traps, but the beastmen had taken his ideas to the next level. He had left out that the Viet Cong would occasionally cover their versions of the traps with feces and other contaminants, but Blair, in her usual sadism, had realized the effectiveness of such an addition by herself. By her order, the spikes were not just covered in excrement, but in all manner of other terrible things, ranging from blood-thinning poisons to what passed for concentrated poison ivy oils in their homeland. It was beyond cruel, but by now Vaile had come to expect this from the vindictive monster that Blair had long since become. But that all was neither here nor there. Vaile had to watch and wait for the potential time to arrive when he would be needed upon the field. He was glad about one thing, though. The feeling of someone watching him from the treetops was gone, for now. However, he had a sneaking suspicion as to who and what had been stalking him, and he began to prepare an item designed to help players escape dangerous situations. Even though there was no way to set the destination his little escape plan would send him to, he was pretty sure the random teleportation coordinates generator would get him somewhere safe. As long as he didn't end up back in Rattan-controlled territory, he was fine with ending up wherever. A broken bar. Blair tried looking for the stealthiest member of the Five-Clawed Paw, but after she had discovered and surprised the blade of the Vermin Queen at one time she was unable to locate her again. Squick's momentary slip in concentration had allowed Blair to realize that there was going to be an attempt made to steal Vaile away, and now that such knowledge was known to her and was being spread amongst her followers, there was little chance that Vaile would be kidnapped in the open. Still, the battlefield was a chaotic place, so she had to be careful to make sure that Vaile was not snatched from under her nose. She still wanted to mate with him, because of course she did, but the war had not given her many chances. No doubt Vaile could feel that his time for delaying the affections of the many does around him was nearing its end, and Blair was unsure of how he would respond to the deluge of females heading his way at the end of the conflict. With a flap of her large, jet-black wings, Blair made her way into the sky and began the preparations needed to bring down a whole lot of spells on friend and foe alike. Buffs for allies would be aplenty, and so too would be the number of debuffs and other nasty magical surprises for her enemies. She had barely tapped the surface of her mana pool, and she still had another 9 hours before the sun began to vanish behind the tall and imposing trees. Of course, even when night fell, there would be no respite for the Rian forces here. She could go all night and still have enough energy to throw down a fair bit longer. She may not have been a good front-line fighter, but her wings and proficiency with magic gave her all the capacity she needed to rain down devastation upon her foes. She flew off through the trees, all the while dropping buffs and debuffs here and there to make things easier for the beastmen who had flanked the Rian. The idiots had rushed all the way to the mobile platform, going all the way to the very limit of the forest itself, and now were being pushed deeper into it. Truly, their moron of a leader was utterly unfit for command. Not that he would be in command for much longer at least, Not if Blair and Durka got their way. Hell and damnation, King Lion exclaimed as he fought off another 5 beastmen that had come after him. Despite being a meathead with a tactical and strategic sense of a particularly dumb clump of moss, even he had realized that he had been caught in a trap. Neither he nor his soldiers had expected that the beastmen would pose such a threat, nor had they anticipated that their rush to reclaim their stolen honor would have led them into such a dangerous position. Then again, the reason his soldiers did not object was either, both due to being as tactically and strategically inept as their king and or due to being too terrified of their liege's wrath to speak up. The battle they were in was heavily in the favor of the dumb and savage animals, as each minute that passed saw the Rian pushed further and further into the dreaded carnivorous forest. Sure, each and every Rian had the ability to navigate this place even without levels in the Ranger class or its subclass, but none of them were at the level of even a young beastman in terms of ability to find one's way through the cursed woods. I challenged the leader of the beastmen, Lion roared, hoping that his demands would be met and that he could wipe the floor with their primitive ruler. In his eyes, if he managed to defeat their leader, he figured that it would cause the rest of the savages to break and run. At least that was how he hoped things would go. After all, he was a descendant of one of the great Rian kings, and therefore he was immeasurably stronger than even the leader of these monsters. The din of battle subsided a bit, allowing his soldiers to pull back and gather on his position, but while the monsters were not attacking, he did not see their leader anywhere. Perhaps they were already about to break, and his challenge was enough to shake them to their core. Typical animals, fight them long enough and then yell at them and they turn tail like the cowards that they are. King Lion's smugness was short-lived, however, as the crunching of foliage gave away the presence of a beastman unlike any other in terms of size. As the monster approached, Lion could see that its body was covered in scars that had long since healed over and had the obvious sign of being tortured with hot irons. Among other things, the bulging musculature of the gigantic savage made the heavily muscled king feel slightly inadequate in comparison, which was not a feeling he was comfortable with in the slightest. "You are the ruler of these animals?" King Lion asked in a haughty voice. "Are you finally ready to face me in honorable combat and decide the fate of all here in a one-on-one duel to the death?" "I am King Lion Simba Best Tyrell, rightful ruler of the lands you have stolen from me and my people through unjust and cowardly actions." "State your name, if your kind even has the concept of such a thing." The beastman huffed, tensed itself and then loosened up before finally speaking in racial common. "I have no need to give you my name, but I suppose you won't shut up unless I do." "I am Durka Wildheart, chosen of the beast gods and leader of the Mercy faction of my kind. And let us not forget who it was who originally stole whose lands from whom." "Now, shut up about your stupid sense of honor and prepare yourself and your warriors for oblivion. The beast gods will feast tonight, and they shall feast upon the souls of all those who fight against them on this field." "What?" the king cried in confusion and a bit of fear. "None of you are leaving this field alive. But as for those in my territory after this is over, I'll be merciful, unlike my daughter. Now, fight and die as your empty and hollow sense of honor demands." The beastman then bellowed out his commands to the rest of his kind. "Grak Thursday Malkar." This elicited roars of approval from the rest of the monsters, who rushed forwards to re-enter battle with the reinforcers. "You mindless, savage animals!" screamed Lion as he rushed towards the largest beastman, the one with all the marks on his body and the one who was obviously their leader. He would take this mongrel down, and then he would cut the rest of these monsters to ribbons. No, he wouldn't even use his family sword to do the job. He would beat them all to a bloody mess with his bare hands. The king swung his broadsword at the tribal leader, only for the monster to lash out at him with a thorny whip, forcing the monarch back and out of range of the weapon. Lion then tried to rush around the monster, hoping the creature's larger frame meant that it could not move as quickly. However, this notion was quickly put to rest as the oversized beastman was not only able to follow Lion's movements but react accordingly. This led the king to pick up a hand axe of one of his fallen soldiers and fling it at his foe. He expected the beastman to dodge or use the whip to smack it out of the air, which would give him a window to attack. The beastman did neither of these things and instead caught the handle of the axe, flipped it around and threw it at one of the Rian soldiers, burying the head of it into the back of its target and allowing the Rian soldier's original opponent to claim his life. The beastman then gave what Lion thought was a smirk and asked in common, "Got any more toys for me to use against you?" King Lion was now beyond furious and piled multiple martial skills on top of each other. Lower speed boost, lower strength boost, lower perception boost, lower exceed limits. Single shot bile bunker fist, left. Single shot bile bunker fist, right. Lesser dangerous blade dance. And finally, lower full body overload. After self-buffing himself to an absurd degree, at least for a non-monster/mob, the king ran to the flank of the beastman tribal leader and tossed his broadsword like a giant throwing knife. The blade flew faster than the beastman could fully react to and lodged itself into the creature's left shoulder, forcing the beastman to drop its whip that was in its left hand and draw its axe with its right. But the king was not done yet. He continued to move around his much larger foe and with two well-placed punches caused his animal to nearly fall to its knees. Shortly after the right-left combo, the effects of two of the king's buffs came into play, giving the giant of a beastman another two delayed but very heavy impacts that were, unlike normal punches, far more like directed spikes of kinetic energy than a normal body blow. This caused the beastman to cough up some blood, and desperately swing his axe around to try and stop the king from punching him again and again, which did not work. Finally, Lion gave the monster an uppercut to the jaw, sending the hulking frame of his foe into the air and down to the ground. As the king stood triumphant over his foe, the beastman who lay before him did the unthinkable. It began to laugh. "What's so funny?" the king asked, his eyes filled with a mix of slight confusion and a sneaking sense of dread. "That's all you have?" the beastman grumbled in common. "What a broken bar?" King Lion replied, his sense of dread growing at an alarming rate. The beastman then leapt to its feet and tossed its axe to the side. "That was a nice warm-up," it grunted, causing Lion to unconsciously take a step back. The giant of a beastman looked down on the king and smirked as it made its declaration. "Now, it's my turn." It was at that moment that King Lion knew he had fucked up, because as the beastman began to buff itself with martial skills that he had never even heard of, the backlash from all of the buffs he had placed on his unprepared body caught up with him, sending surges of agony through the king's body. His pain receptors screamed at him as he felt the bones in his body fracture and his muscles begin to tear. He would need weeks if not months of time to recover from this, but something told him that he would not need to worry about recovery ever again. As the king fell to his hands and knees, trying desperately to turn off the pain that was setting his body ablaze, the beastman that stood over him just kept buffing itself until at last the world went completely black and the last king of the Bestial Kingdom exploded into a bloody, gory mess. As the king of the Bestial Kingdom was meeting his match, the daughter of Durka Wildheart was engaged in a duel of a very different kind. While King Lion had never really respected the use of magic, mostly due to him seeing it as cowardly and partially due to the fact that Rian generally did not have high magical potential, he did have a court mage. It was this mage, whose name is irrelevant and unneeded, that had tried to snipe Blair Wildheart out of the sky with a subpar fireball spell. Unfortunately for the nameless court mage who, might I add, was sporting a six-pack, because there was no way that the king would allow a scrawny weakling to be his court mage, his skill with magic was grossly inferior to Blair's. Despite being ripped for a mage, all the muscles in the world would not boost one's magical potential and ability. To be brutally honest, there was a very good reason why magic users were generally scrawny and wimpy looking. It takes a lot of energy and time to build muscles, and it takes just as much time and energy, if not more, to learn and master the mysteries of magic. Those with the potential can either waste it by getting physically stronger, or they can skimp out on building their bodies and instead hone their prowess with spells and the like. King Lion's insistence that his court mage be physically fit was now coming back to bite the poor fool who had made the cut. His stats and class levels were not ideal for either the role of mage or fighter, and he was, instead, a poor hybrid of both, having few of both classes' strengths and many of their weaknesses. All in all, he was poorly built, and Blair was exploiting the hell out of that. As she flew around the trees and between the bodies of the Rian military men/women, the hopelessly caught mage could not let a spell go without invariably hitting one of his own. Blair, on the other hand, was not in the mood for targeting such a poorly built fool. Instead of focusing on one of the few mages in the best Hyrule Kingdom, or what was left of it, she laid down buffs on her allies, debuffs on her foes and dropped the occasional damaging spell on any Rian unfortunate enough to be in sight. While the unnamed court mage desperately tried to follow the winged beastman shaman/witch, the forest was dark and filled with the sounds, sights and smells of the ugly free-for-all that was taking place within it, and Blair had decided that being in the eyes of the fool was too much of a hassle. It would have effectively been divine intervention for the nameless Rian mage to spot Blair at this point, let alone hit her with anything now that she was purposefully playing hard to get. However, the mage did realize that if he didn't do anything about Blair, the situation would only get even worse. Therefore, he concocted a plan that he was certain would allow him to secure a chance to target and defeat the owl-winged animal person. He gathered the few mages left of the already quite few that had joined the fight and began to pretend that they were conducting a dangerous ritual designed to generate a massive blast of fire. However, a broken bar, Blair peeked out from behind the leaves as she stood up high above the battle taking place below, the branch of the tree she stood upon barely noticing her weight at all. She could tell that the wannabe muscled mages were just trying to deceive her, and she was not going to have any of that. She could easily tell that they were only pretending to channel their combined power into a larger spell, as could any magic user who had spent enough time interacting with mana on a fundamental level. These mages were amateurs at best and absolute idiots at worst. They seemed to have no idea that the mana that they were channeling together into the fake spell was not simply going to come back to them once they stopped. She could just waltz over to them and wipe the floor with a lot of them, but she had a better idea. In her mind, it was better to wait until they either ran out of mana altogether, a dangerous position to be in for any mage, even the muscled kind, or until they realized that their trick was not going to work, which of course would almost certainly be after enough of them lost all or most of their mana in their pointless exercise. When that happened, she had a spell that she had prepared just for the right situation. Blair had hoped to use this little horror of a spell on the damned king of these Rian, but her father was already done killing the bastard, so she would have to settle for these imbeciles. She had never used it on a mage before, though, so the mad mage within her was very curious as to what, if any, new effects would take place. The last time she had used this spell, the look on the faces of the victim and of those who were collateral damage were priceless, and Blair nearly squealed in delight as she pictured the mages' faces contorting in agony and fear. She did not have to wait long until the Rian mages stopped channeling their mana into the fake spell. As it seemed to Blair, the Rian mages were just as impatient as their now dead monarch and had given up their attempt to lure Blair out into the open only a few minutes after it had begun. Now both physically exhausted and with a good chunk of their mana pool depleted, Blair knew that now was the time to strike. She raised her staff into the air and began channeling her own mana into a spell that no good person would ever use. The Rian mages felt the surge of energy building in the treetops and hastily began shooting their magical projectiles up in Blair's general direction, but their accuracy was heavily limited due to their exhaustion and their own short emotional fuses. Blair smirked as she unleashed her spell, shouting the name of it for all to hear. Monstrous re-evolution. The power of her spell surged forwards like a tidal wave, crashing into her intended victims and funneling itself into their bodies, eventually fusing with their minds, bodies and even their very souls. At first, nothing happened, and this elicited jeers and mockery from her targets, but soon enough they began to feel the effects of her cruel and inhumane curse that had been placed upon them. Laughter turned to cries of pain and then shrieks of fear and the retching sounds of stomachs being emptied. These were then followed by the cracking of bone and rending of flesh as the bodies of the mages began to twist and contort into new and monstrous shapes. Their forms bulged and shrank again and again until at last the men and women they once were existed no longer, and in their place was some unspeakable abomination of meat, bone and sinew. Blair looked down upon her handiwork and patted herself on the back before ordering the grotesque monsters she had created to turn on their former comrades, and with that done she once again took flight, this time heading for where Vaile was supposed to be. While Durka and Blair were doing their thing, Vaile had been engaged in a bit of combat of his own. While almost all of the best Tyrell Kingdom's surviving military might had rushed off to avenge the humiliation and subsequent death of their now lifeless queen, some had stayed behind on King Lion's orders in order to act as the base defense force and, if necessary, the cavalry. There were not nearly as many Rian in the base as there were attempting to assault the beastmen, and as the fighting dragged on, the forces not in the base began to be pushed deeper and deeper into the Chinerous forest, eventually vanishing from sight entirely as they passed beyond the point of no return. Still, the men and women of the base defense force would not leave their posts. They had not received any signals indicating that their comrades were in trouble, but little did they know that this was due to the deployable message jammers that Vaile had deployed before the battle had started. While designed to keep players from contacting each other using in-game chat, the message jammers were also quite useful at blocking any NPC chatter. Vaile had lifted these from a handful of artificers back during the game and had used them to great effect when in raids. These tools had made it all the easier for him to sneak past the raid groups and snatch bosses and unique mobs, because when the entire group can't communicate through in-game means, the sneakier players can move around with far greater ease. Now these tools were being used to keep his opponents from noticing their comrades' predicament, and Vaile was now ready to take the fight to the Rian. With speed only a max-level player or a suitably leveled entity could produce, Vaile bolted from the tree line and plowed straight through the flimsy wooden barricades that the Rian had hastily erected just a few days prior. The impact of his body slamming into the dried wood sent shards and shivers of timber flying like an oversized shotgun blast, but this only killed and injured a handful of the Rian within the base. Having spread their numbers out all over the structure in order to spot any potential attacks, the garrison was unable to respond to Vaile's assault in time. In fact, the men and women on the section of wall that Vaile had smashed his way through were sent flying and landed with a meaty thudding sound, the wooden shrapnel that once was their fortifications now embedded within a few of them. Vaile wasted no time with making a monologue, and instead went to work demolishing the walls bit by bit. A swatting of his walking stick here and a tackle there, and Vaile had punched exactly 26 different holes in the walls. It was at that point he started actively attacking the Rian soldiers. He of course started the melee with his new signature move, speeding over to the commander in charge of the base defense force and kicking him in the groin so hard that those nearby expected that the crunch could be heard over a mile away. The transference of force into the Rian was nearly perfect, as once Vaile's foot stopped moving the giant of a man was sent flying into the air in a parabola, eventually coming down to the ground and snapping his neck on impact. The stunned defenders barely managed to draw their weapons before Vaile had once again crotch-punted another Rian, this time a far more fragile duck Rian, off his feet and down the nearby water well. A few more crotch-punts after that, and the Vaile got tired of crushing the flesh and bones of his foes with a well-placed application of his foot, instead deciding that he should use his walking stick instead, as it was his primary melee weapon in the game and thus had far more combat-oriented bonuses than his shoes and socks did. Stopping in the middle of the now heavily damaged encampment, Vaile twirled his walking stick around for a bit before pointing its tip at a single Rian. From behind his mask, Vaile modulated his voice to sound deeper and more gravely and also far more intimidating. He knew full well his voice was already disturbing to the members of the races that were not aligned with his tamed beings and their descendants, but he was ever the one to introduce a bit of theater to any situation he could. "Tonight a broken bar," he growled. The smell of urine began to flow from the people around him and was soon accompanied by the stench of another, far more filthy form of waste. The Rian he had pointed his stick at, cowered in a mixture of disgust and terror and finally ran like hell as his nerves shattered like an egg dropped from 10 stories up. No tears, Vaile said as his modulated voice continued to give those around him a reason to flee. Only dreams. With that haunting and bizarre declaration, Vaile lunged at the fleeing Rian and with a swing of his walking stick he smashed the spine of the fleeing being and then proceeded to accidentally move his staff all the way through the body of his foe, cutting the poor fool in half through sheer force alone. As the top of the Rian's body danced in the air, it sprayed a mixture of blood and other fluids, materials, some of which landed on Vaile's white and red ensemble. Vaile looked down at his gore-covered walking stick and shook the nastiness off with a single fluid motion before turning to look at the rest of his potential targets. Who is next on the chopping block? At that question, the rest of the Rian lost their will to fight and fled like the devil himself was on their heels. Vaile decided not to chase them, as they really had nowhere that they could run to that wasn't a place where they would eventually meet a terrible end. If they tried to hide in the shattered impromptu fort, they would be found and killed by the beastmen. If they ran into the woods, they would either die of hunger, thirst, the elements, the flora or the fauna. Content with this knowledge, Vaile collected the message jammers before he disrobed and began to clean his outfit. Unlike the beastmen and some others among his tamed beings and of course their descendants, Vaile really did not much care for having the remains of his enemies all over his body and clothing, nor did he find the smell all that appealing to begin with. Besides, if he left the gunk on it could possibly have a chance at staining his attire, and Vaile was quite proud of his clothing and thus he did not want it to be blemished in the slightest. As he finished cleaning his clothes and re-equipping them, he felt a chill crawl up his spine and smelled a certain unforgettable odor. No, a broken bar, Vaile said with growing despair as he slowly turned around. Behind where he stood was a single being that stood taller than he was and had the features of a large anthropomorphic black rat. The clothes that she wore were an outfit made of the tanned faces of tens if not hundreds of people of various species, a testament to not just her sadistic tendencies and genetic predisposition towards malice, but also to her moniker of a face stealer. The rat woman was smiling, if only in a way that was akin to that of a sexual predator trying to lure a small child into the back of their windowless van, and Vaile knew that this was the moment that he had to get the fuck out of Dodge. Please, husband king, don't try and run, flee. Come with me and we will take you back to Anestlair. All that you could ever want need is waiting for you, and no one will steal you from us ever again. Vaile was not about to become a stud horse just yet. No. Not just not now, but also not ever. Thinking fast, he activated the random destination teleporter and immediately blinked both out of sight and out of reach of the squeak, which sent the rattan into a blind rage that kept her from noticing that she was being watched from place both above and afar. A broken bar. As Squeak screamed and raged in frustration, Blair watched on with a mixture of annoyance and schadenfreude. While she had wanted to conceive children with Vaile, she had realized many weeks ago that anyone who claimed Vaile for themselves would earn the ire and wrath of all others who sought him. Thus, in a rather intelligent move, she had decided that she was content to wait until Vaile had made up his mind about what to. Although she was aware of what she thought was an inevitability. She knew that Vaile couldn't keep running forever, and once everyone connected to him knew of his presence on the world and had, in some way or another, formed a bond with him, he would have to eventually accept the role they all almost certainly would give him. Maybe he wouldn't be a stud horse like some would have wanted, but the affections of so many would invariably make him the king of the world, surrounded by a de facto harem, whether he wanted it or not. While not immortal, she felt she could afford to wait things out. Besides, she had a territory to run now that the war was effectively over. As for the rat who tried to take what was not exclusively hers, well, the blow to the ego that Vaile had delivered was more than enough in her eyes. She turned her eyes towards the fleeing Rian and flew off in their direction. She would make sure that none of them had a chance, and after that, well, there were many things she had to do to the Rian in order to repay their sins against her kind in equal measure, and she had all the time in the world to enact her vengeance. The light that surrounded him faded, and Vaile was able to open his eyes once again and behold the exact area his little trick had sent him. However, as he opened his eyes, he was momentarily blinded by an absurdly bright light. Thankfully, The mask he wore had its effects kick in just a second later, but for the moment Vaile was still reeling from the after effects of what was, effectively, a natural flashbang, but without the bang portion. He instinctively tried to cover his eyes but found that he could not move his arms. No, it was not just his arms that he could not move, but his legs, his torso, his hands, his feet and, in some capacity, his neck. As his eyes finished adjusting, he tried to look down and see what the problem was. The thing restricting his movement was a single four-letter word that a space wizard samurai monk described as something that was coarse, rough and gets everywhere. Yes, he was nearly up to his chin in sand, and he thanked the makers of the game that the equipment system forbade such things from worming their way inside clothing. Vaile tested how much force he needed to use to move the sand around him, only to discover that he had to exert a not insubstantial amount of power to push the sand away and allow himself to move even slightly. At this rate, it would take at least the rest of the day to get free a broken bar. "What have we here?" A voice from someone that Vaile found himself unable to determine the gender of sounded out from behind him. Hastily popping up his minimap which had been turned off by the teleportation, Vaile discovered that a group of roughly 10 desert elves who all had dismally low levels in comparison to his own, were behind him. He sighed internally and chastised himself for failing to guess their identity based on the terrain and the fact that they spoke in common. The races were almost never his ally, and Vaile wanted them to either go away, help dig him out or simply die right then and there. He knew from the game that elves were territorial, and that among the many sub-races under the blanket moniker of a elf, the desert elves were by far one of the most dangerous to encounter. They had a nasty habit of killing first and not even bothering to ask questions, making them one of the most niche variants of the elven race to play. Heck, simply playing as a desert elf was a potential recipe for disaster, as players would start not in a city but in a random place in their overall territory. It was then up to chance whether the player would survive or not. Still, Vaile did need a bit of help, so maybe having such negative thoughts wasn't the best idea. "A little help, please?" Vaile asked, trying to turn his head a little to show he was very much in a bind. "How about a broken bar number?" With that, the desert elves moved on, leaving Vaile trapped in the sand. "Fuck you, you crazy isolationist bastards!" Vaile shouted, but his words fell on deaf ears. Vaile sighed, and began trying to squirm his way free. This would take a while. A broken bar. Meanwhile, deep inside a bunker complex in a place both far away from the new world and impossibly close to it at the same time, a single giant machine hummed with power. The algorithms and programs it used to keep itself from failing were beginning to fail, but not by large margins. Such failings were well within the acceptable limits, and there had been times when such things had happened in the past. However, what the Warden AI had failed to realize was that the failures in the prison were happening at an accelerated rate. Likewise, it failed to notice that these failings within the prison were starting a slow but steady cascade reaction that not only affected the prisoners, but also the programs designed to keep the prisoners from realizing that they were shackled to begin with. The failures it noted were comparatively minor when viewed alongside the ones of the distant past, but the signs were there. It was likely that this lack of attention on the part of the Warden AI was due to the injection of the variable, which had thrown the entire prison system for a loop when it was forcefully added. On closer inspection, if it was possible to do such a thing, any decent programmer worth their salt would have noticed that there was a bit of malicious code that had combined with the Warden AI, if not for the fact that said code had cut the prison off from any and all outside interference and observation. The people tasked with making sure the system was working perfectly would have noticed that something was very, very wrong. Such people would likely have attempted to take actions that would halt the plans made by those who sought to free the prisoners, which was why such a piece of malware was added as a Trojan that accompanied the injection of the variable into the system. Thus, the Warden AI began to slowly lose touch with what was going on in the prison it was created to control. Like a poor parent whose growing lack of concern for their children and their actions, the Warden AI was gradually caring less and less about making sure that it fulfilled its purpose. By now, 3 pillars had fallen, and the dominoes that would lead to the destruction of the fourth were beginning to fall. By the estimates of the cultists who had infiltrated the team tasked with keeping the prison operation, the shackles holding their gods in place would break within a matter of a year at least and 2 years at most. The dominoes had already started to fall, and soon there would be no one and nothing both inside and outside the prison that could stop the jailbreak that was to come.